We're at a really interesting moment in public debate in the UK at the moment, because I think people are realising that what we have is broken in some fundamental way, and they're yearning for change. But they don't know what that kind of change looks like yet. They might have some good ideas about what the change should look like. They might have some terrible ideas about what the change should look like. What I see as my job is to try and persuade people that the change they need is one that is rooted in kind of free markets and individualism, that it's not about, on the left, kind of government taking over the economy and sort of mission directing the private sector. Equally, though, it's not about kind of the strong man who, forget about the rule of law, forget about democracy, I know what to do and let's just get on and do it. There is a tendency when people think things are broken to go in those directions. Because actually, if you're saying things are broken, what we need to do is get out of the way and let people flourish, people say, well, that's a lot to take on a leap of faith.
Yeah, so the great thing about Zia was he was willing to give us 2 hours.
Yeah.
Actually, I think he would have gone longer.
Yeah.
I think if it was his choice, he would have just gone as long as he wanted. Unfiltered. I could ask any question. And he sat and gave solid answers for 2 hours. And I think you want that from your politicians. I know he's not an MP, he's a chairman, but
presumably he will be an MP if they get into government, but I
don't know. I don't know if there's a desire to stay as a chairman. That's a different kind of role. But you want to hear that for 2 hours. It was like when Trump did Rogan and did a 3-hour interview. I mean, the best part of that wasn't the bit where he was talking about policy. It was where he was talking about MMA. You're like, oh, this is a real guy. Yeah. I would love to have Keir Starmer there for 2 hours, 3 hours. I'd love to talk to him about Arsenal.
Yeah.
I'd ask tough questions, but I'm not here to attack. But you don't get that from the Labour Party. They don't do these things. Reform, they're all over the podcast scene. And naturally, I think it's the best forum because I think it's fiercely independent and you get these unfiltered conversations. But it was impressive. I'm quite drawn to Reform at the moment, but with reservations, Tom, because we're going to talk a lot about this today. My view is the only thing, or the starting point, the foundations for how we repair our country is the money, the economic system. Can they do it? Let me give you a setup to this interview.
Okay, cool.
So, Connor's my son.
Yep.
We talk a lot about money, finance. Today on the way down, I put on Ray Dalio's new book, The Long-Term Debt Cycle. And we didn't get really to listen to much of it because we go 5 minutes in and Connor has questions. So we dived into the Cypriot debt crisis, what happened with Northern Rock, the Greek debt crisis. And Connor was asking really good questions about debt. We talked about the free banking era in the US, the creature from Jekyll Island. Should we have central banks? So we had a broad discussion about the economy, banks, central banks, finance, debt. And actually, what was the big question you asked me? Do you remember? About debt?
Do we need debts?
Should we have debt? If debt causes so much problem, I had my answer. What would your answer be to that?
Probably have a lot more of it than we should have.
Yeah.
I think it is useful overall. And if we didn't have debt, if we didn't have, if we were entirely reliant on equity, you would really struggle for business development massively, I think. So I think it is essential, but we've set up a system in so many ways. Partly it's the government just borrowing. But then we have skewed private sector incentives towards debt as well. And the degree of debt that we're accumulating and the pace at which we continue to accumulate it is a big problem.
Do you think that's because of government? Because they're the backstop?
Yeah, I think in a way, yes. There are all sorts of things that we've done to make the economy more debt-laden, basically. You could even go back to kind of limited liability for company directors and stuff and say that this enables corporates to take on more debt than they would maybe in a purely anarchic free market. Now, we might say that's actually a good thing and that's driven a lot of progress. I think that's probably right. But nonetheless, that's kind of an intervention which increases the propensity towards debt. There's all kinds of things in the tax system. And of course, government kind of sets the tone as well. We haven't had a balanced budget or a surplus in a quarter of a century now. So it's borrow.
Entire lifetime.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll probably get onto Adam Smith on the way home at some point and start discussing the invisible hand. But the reason I was really intrigued to meet you and talk to you, and I'm really glad that you guys reached out, is the economic shows are my favorite to make.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I know enough to protect myself, but not enough to be able to be a revolutionary. I can't be a writer. I can't be an MP. I think I could do a better job than Rachel Reeves in government. But I think one of the biggest struggles we have in society now is when we talk about economics, is convincing people of the idea of free markets and how free should a free market be.
Yeah.
So
Let me just turn this off, by the way. Sorry.
That's fine. And I'm conscious of things like the criticisms of Thatcher privatising.
Things is a very vague...
What is that?
What do you listen to?
Nothing. I think I may have accidentally triggered Gemini and it was responding to your... Maybe do you want to just talk to an AI instead of me?
You've done that in this. It was a funny one. So I taught my AI to call me babe. So I say, hey, chat, and go, hey, babe. And anyway, we talked about it. Was it Daniel Priestley? We had the interview and I said, oh, have you not been using this? Talking to him. He's like, no. And I picked it up as a demonstration. I was like, hey, chat. I went, hey, babe, live on the show, which was embarrassing. But yeah, so I struggle with free markets myself in that I understand the invisible hand. I understand natural debt cycles. And I understand in a natural debt cycle, we have to have recessions. I understand all of that, but I also understand the incentives of private equity. I've seen what's happened to the water industry, and I don't think it's good. So I am a supporter of the idea of free markets. I have a number of ideas which are definitely libertarian. I'm not full anarchist. I believe that government's a natural monopoly, and in some ways, a lot of the freedoms we get come from government and the establishment of constitutions, whether it's US Constitution, separation of powers. So I'm in a confused state. So it's like, for now, it's a good time to talk to you.
I don't think that's a confused state, actually. I mean, that's sort of the preamble to the US Constitution, isn't it? That government's constituted among men to protect certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And obviously, they've started doing all kinds of other things on top of that as well. But that is the kind of irreducible core of what the government is there for, to protect us from roving bandits and actually allow free society to flourish. So, I mean, I love meeting and talking to some of the anarcho-capitalists in our movement. But that's not necessarily the approach that I think is sort of practical. It's theoretically interesting. And I mean, it is certainly true when you look historically, right? There are all sorts of things that you take for granted now that the government absolutely has to do. But say in the Industrial Revolution, it was all done privately. Construction of the roads, the construction of the railways, canals, etc. Healthcare. We had a massive private healthcare market in the UK. Didn't look like, say, the American healthcare market, but it was very well developed before the government really started getting involved. Schools as well, largely education provided by the church. You might think that's a bad thing or a good thing, but nevertheless, it was there. But clearly there is a role for government in helping to make everything work and make markets possible. But I think you've got to, it's totally natural to point at the water industry and say, look what's gone on here.
Are they the new roving bandits?
I wouldn't say they're the new roving bandits. I mean, I think that there have clearly been some pretty epic failures in the water industry. You've also got to remember, though, this is an incredibly heavily regulated industry. It's not a free market. It may be actually that a government region, it could be that a government regional monopoly or something would actually be better than a very highly state-managed private corporation. Now, I actually still think that the efficiency gains and everything you got from privatisation are worth it, despite some of the problems that have happened. And the big one there for me, right, is that we had absolutely massive capital infrastructure spending backlogs when all of these private utilities were privatised. And for the most part, that's all been done by the private sector, by people putting in their money, expecting a return. That's money that either taxpayers would have had to stump up, or it's money that just wouldn't have been spent and our infrastructure would have degraded further and further. And I think you can look at the state of like the NHS, physical infrastructure, lack of machines, like chronic underinvestment compared to pretty much every other developed country, and think, had government remained in charge, it wouldn't have been the perfect version of government. It would have been one that basically never spent any money on anything capital, because there's always, paying pensioners or paying people who are unemployed, that's always going to be a high priority, right? rather than upgrading the sewer system in Nottingham or whatever. You do get that with the private sector. It's been imperfect, and I think we can massively improve on it. And I'm quite up for thinking quite radically, how do we change this altogether? Because what you've got is a government-constructed thing. It's not a natural market. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying it's not working. Let's try and take the best bits of what we've got and come up with some kind of different regulatory model that's going to be better.
I think we would be in agreement that our country is not in a good state. The economy is not in a good state. And there's lots of various issues which we're going to talk about, which may be taxations and incentives and this drift towards socialism that we've had. I was listening to a fantastic podcast yesterday that said we're a lot more similar to the Soviet Republic before the fall of the Iron Curtain than we are different. And I think there's some validity in all of that. But back to my point, though, one of the biggest challenges I'm finding right now is trying to convince enough people that for a healthy, prosperous society, we want as small a government as possible, the lowest tax burden we can afford, whilst to incentivize a private market. And it's interesting you brought up the US Declaration of Independence, because I must have read it 20, 30 times in the last few months. I brought it up on the show a bunch. I've been reading a lot of history. I just worked my way through. David Starkey recommended I read the Reflections on the French Revolution. Like, I'm really digging back into history. And as I go back to the Declaration of Independence, you brought up the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, we have life. I think there's very strong arguments that our liberty in this country has been infringed quite severely over the last few decades. But I was really focusing in on the pursuit of happiness, what that actually means. And we've gutted the middle class over the last couple of decades for sure. Do you know Dominic Frisby?
Yeah.
He talked to me about inflation being the biggest crime that has been enacted on us. And he explained it quite clearly to me. He said, if you went back 30 years, you could have a family, 2 parents, a couple of kids, 3 kids. It'd be a 1-salary home, but they could afford to own their home, maybe have a holiday and a car, and they could afford their shopping. And it maybe wouldn't be great. But now we're in a stage where, and I know this from experience, this is where the conversation with Connor started, is that I've got friends where they're bringing in 2 wages and they get to, after paying their bills and food, they've got hardly any disposable income.
Yeah.
Traditionally middle class. And that's where the conversation with housing came with Connor, is that I said, look, when we destroyed the money and people wanted to save for the future, if they couldn't save in the bank, they would save with assets like housing. So we've created this asset bubble. Trying to convince people that this is all at the door of government and government policy and central banks is really hard, because there are a lot of people who demonize wealth, they demonize success, and think the government should be taxing and redistributing the money. And it's a really hard shift to get.
Yeah.
So where do we start? I mean, I tell you where we start. If you're a doctor of the economy, what's your diagnosis?
Yeah, all right. Well, look, I mean, I think ultimately that all comes back to a lack of economic growth.
Yes.
And I do think about it in those terms a lot. Economists are always like, let's maximize GDP and talk about consumption aggregates or whatever. Ultimately, what do you want a good economy for? So people can flourish, so people can live their best lives, so that their children can be better off than they are and their grandchildren better off still. And that was sort of a promise which was fulfilled for a long time. Actually, you had centuries of human existence, millennia, where that didn't happen, where life was just a grind and it was, short and unpleasant for the most part. It was really only in relatively modern history, right, particularly with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, where we broke out of the so-called Malthusian trap, where things would go well for a while, but then you'd have too many people and things would get tight and it would all go into reverse. And you had this sort of cycle of deprivation, if you like. Then suddenly we learned how to create and how to mass produce and support growing populations and, give them rising living standards over time and everything. And that continued for a good century, even longer than a century, right? But now we're in a situation where things feel like they've ground to a halt. And so if you look back to the financial crisis, we've had almost no growth since then. And I think things weren't all that great beforehand. It was covered up by a really booming financial sector. But once that fell away, things looked really grim. So you got what? Oh, we got some.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Someone's fact checking for us.
Yeah. So I think in per capita terms, it's like 0.75% per year GDP growth since 2007-8.
Can you look up GDP per capita?
If you talk about real wages, they've gone up by like 1.5% in 15 years. And that's nothing. That's not even something that people are going to notice. Meanwhile, housing's become more expensive. Energy has become massively more expensive. All kinds of things are more expensive than they used to be. Our wages haven't gone up. And so this is not great. And it breeds this sort of contempt for government, this contempt for the private sector, really just a sense of kind of misery about the future, that we're not going anywhere, that we're not progressing. And I think when societies get grumpier and grumpier, they lose that sense of optimism. You don't get the ideas and the innovations and the breakthroughs and actually the long-term investments that you need. And so that human flourishing, which ultimately is what it's all about, not about GDP, but about the lives we're able to lead, we don't end up where we want to be.
And it's funny because I talk a lot about my hometown of Bedford on the show.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about, it feels like we've had this rapid decline where, yes, less shops open, more boarded up, more alcoholics, more drug addicts, more shoplifting. And I said to Con, it feels like it's been rapid over the last decade. He thinks more like 5 years. But what's quite interesting is you look at this, GDP per capita growth was pretty good up until about the financial crisis.
Yeah, look at that.
And then since then, we can argue it's essentially fallen.
Yeah.
But it's fallen while GDP has grown. Connor asked me this great question the other day. He said, well, when this happens, where does the money go?
Yeah.
Because the money's there. It's been existed. It's gone. Where's it gone?
Yeah. Well, even just regular GDP hasn't grown that much.
Yeah.
So I think in the 15 years before the financial crisis, it was 3% per year average. Since then, it's been about half that rate, 1.5% a year. Now, people say you actually need about 1% a year GDP growth just to keep up with the fact that the population is aging and that fewer people will be in work, or that the people in work will have to support a larger number of people who are in retirement. So actually, how much real growth is there to share around? Not a heck of a lot.
So do you look at the current situation through the lens of what you know and think, well, the solutions here are fairly easy? They need to be radical, but is it fairly obvious what needs to be done?
I think it's obvious in many respects, but it's not easy. And actually, there's a huge amount of complexity under the bonnet that we have to get through, and that I think people like me maybe are guilty of not getting into the detail sufficiently, right? And not coming up with ideas that are actually implementable and that politicians could pursue. But I think if you look at the high level stuff, what's gone wrong? What are the biggest barriers to economic growth that we face? So I think first of all, it is our planning system. It's the fact that it's impossible to build anything, mostly housing, but also data centers or power plants or roads, whatever you like. We're tied up in red tape. We can't build anything. The third runway at Heathrow. I mean, the government first said we're going to do this in 2003. It's actually been talked about going back to the 1980s. I mean, I can remember when I moved to America in 2012, I was pretty fed up with British politics and policy at the time. And I remember thinking, they can't even build a runway. You know, this country's not going anywhere. And that was 2012. Here we are, 15 years later? No, my maths is terrible, sorry, 13 years later. And now we're saying, yeah, okay, we will build that runway again, but maybe it'll be finished in the 2040s. A lot can happen between now and the 2040s. It should not take that long to decide you're going to build a runway and then actually build it.
China could build 20 of them.
They probably could. And there would probably be all kinds of horrible human rights violations involved in that. But there's probably a sweet spot where it takes slightly longer than China, but we're not just stuck in a hole.
I can give you a great example of this. I mentioned it the other day. So I own a football club.
Yeah.
We need a new stadium. And my brother, I work with him closely on, he does the strategic planning side for us internally. And so I went and looked at all the comparable stadiums. Yes, we're talking about small non-league stadiums like a Salford or a Flight, and they're all 12 to 18 months build time. And my brother said, okay, so that probably means we're 6 to 10 years to build a stadium. And I was like, huh? What? And he said, well, the planning phase itself could be 4 to 5 years. I was like, what? We objectively know this stadium is good for the town.
Yeah.
We know if our team goes up the leagues, more people come into Bedford, stay at the hotels, drinks in the pubs, eat at the restaurants. So we know it's good economic. It's good for the local economy. We also know it's good locally because more kids are going to be playing sport and playing football. We know it redevelops an area of land that needs redeveloping. It's going to create jobs. We know it's objectively good for the town. But it's 4 to 5 years planning. Even if we get through that, and I understand like transport planning, that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
But this biodiversity net gain, we've got to look at all these different things. And I'm like, we want to put spades in the ground next week. We're good to go. And it's so frustrating, Tom. So frustrating.
Yeah. No, I mean, that kind of thing is absolutely crazy. And it's not what people actually want. I mean, the other thing, by the way, you'll get bogged down in consultations and dealing with all of the objectors because we've got a crazy system which empowers all of these people who just want to say no to everything. There was some special in the Times recently, right, about Britain's greatest NIMBY. And he's someone who objects basically to every single transport project, road project on environmental grounds. And he has probably cost the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds over the years. And he just thinks, that this kind of his hobby, or this is his life's work, to try and stop things happening. In a way, I don't blame him. I blame the people who set up the system and perpetuate this system that makes that kind of silliness possible. Talk about your stadium. You talk about the economic benefits. Absolutely. Yes, you want to have a plan for like traffic flows around the stadium and everything. That's perfectly sensible. But what do people really care about when you're building a stadium? Apart from traffic, they want to know that the thing is going to be safe.
Yes. That
the stands aren't going to collapse. That's pretty much all people care about. And it goes for housing and everything as well. We talk about all this biodiversity net gain, talk about the bee bricks and whatever else it is, the energy efficiency standards. All of that stuff is maybe useful. And ultimately, those are things that developers should be using to try and sell their properties to people who care about those things, and most people do. But what do most people care about? They want the space and they want a house which is safe. It's not going to fall down and it's not going to catch on fire. And that is basically the kind of planning system that we had in London through its phase of rapid development, or in Manchester and Birmingham when their populations grew by, 3,000% or something over the course of the Industrial Revolution. Imagine that kind of rapid urbanisation, growth and development now. And by the way, it's development we look at now and think, God, that's beautiful. Look at these incredible Victorian buildings, even factories. People want to turn them into fancy apartments and stuff now if they're still standing and in decent condition. Because they're beautiful, and that helps. But basically, what was the rule? The rule in London was you could build up to a certain height and it couldn't be flammable. So you had brick buildings that were capped at a certain height. Now you might say, actually, we don't need the height cap, or that could be relaxed a little bit. But basically, safe buildings, and let's build them in response to market demand. That should be our starting point. And then if people want to argue, well, no, we do need to have a little bit of protection there, a little bit of protection here. Yeah, okay, I'm prepared to compromise on these things. You don't have to be absolutely purist about it. But the simple fact is, we don't have enough houses. We don't have enough and the right kind of infrastructure. We don't have the business premises and the supporting infrastructure that we need for that. We need to build it. The private sector will pay for it if you let them. And it's very obvious. You don't need to plan this stuff, because where should we build? We should build where prices are highest, because that is the market sending a signal that there is massive demand and there is constrained supply. And so let's get going. That's the biggest change that we could make, I think, to get growth going, or at least that's probably a quarter to a third of the problem. Now, the tricky thing here, though, is this has been a problem going all the way back to 1948. When Labour, Clement Attlee's government, nationalised land rights, and we brought in the Town and Country Planning Act and green belts and everything else. And one of the funny things, this is not my original discovery, lots of people have written about it, but Birmingham had been so successful in terms of industrial growth that in the post-war era, Birmingham was not allowed to open any more factories. This was the government saying, there's too much industry in Birmingham, we need to redistribute it around the country.
Stop being successful.
Exactly, stop being successful. And that ultimately is what the planning system does. So that's a big problem, but it's a problem we've had for a long time. So why have things got so much worse since the financial crisis? Well, another big issue is energy policy. If you go back to the early 2000s, energy prices for business were roughly the same here as they were in the US. Now we're at 4 times US industrial energy prices.
And we have some of the most. Why we've deindustrialized.
We question why we've deindustrialized. We have some of the most expensive energy in the world, and it's increasingly insecure and unreliable. And you hear from lots of people who say, They want to, I keep saying data centers, but they want to open a data center. This stuff is important with the advent of AI and everything else. And they'll be told, oh, well, there's a several-year waiting list to get your grid connection. And it's not just data centers. It's all kinds of energy-intensive businesses. They want to build a new premises. They want to connect to the grid. They can't do it because we've made energy scarce, and we're pursuing environmental goals there. Now, this, I think, is a huge problem. I think this has significantly diminished our growth, and it's closer to that inflection point of 2007, 2008, but it does predate it slightly as well. So that's part of the problem. But it was a financial crisis, and things have got a lot worse since that financial crisis, and I think that's an important thing to consider as well. It's not a coincidence.
Can I ask you a question on that? Did the financial crisis essentially teach governments that they can kind of print to infinity? We know they can't. We know the negative impact of quantitative easing. We know all of this, but did it just set this? Did we enter a new era of kind of fiscal and monetary policy?
Oh, absolutely, we did. We did. And I mean, a lot of people were worried when quantitative easing was launched in the wake of the financial crisis that this was going to lead to massive inflation. And it didn't. And so I think that view that printing money leads to inflation was kind of discredited, or it was seen as old hat. It's like these rules don't apply anymore. That might have been the way in the 70s and the 80s, but we're in a new economic era now.
And we get Stephanie Kelton's promoting MMT as a utopian solution to poverty.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people say, well, all these governments are going to go bankrupt unless they really wind back their spending. And that didn't happen either. In fact, interest rates stayed very low. The government was able to borrow and borrow and borrow. And then this reached a sort of peak insanity, if you like, during the pandemic, where we were printing money like crazy. We were borrowing money like there was no tomorrow. I mean, maybe some people thought there was no tomorrow at the time. And it seemed consequence-free for a while. But then it all caught up with us. It caught up with governments. It caught up with us in the form of inflation. And I think some old lessons were relearned. But I still think we have this psychology that money is free, or at least very cheap, and that debt is costless. And we just don't need to worry about that. We'll leave it to future generations to worry about. And I do think, by the way, there were some misunderstandings, and there was some people making wrong arguments in the wake of the financial crisis about quantitative easing. Because money, like everything else, there's a supply side and there's a demand side. And you basically had effectively the demand for money falling rapidly. The demand to hold money rising rapidly. So that offset an increasing supply. I mean, to put that in more straightforward terms, banks were required to hold vastly more reserves as a result of post-financial crisis regulation. So all of that money that we were creating, most of it at least, was being sterilized, is the economic term. But it was just sitting on bank balance sheets. It wasn't actually trickling out into the economy. And so what central bankers were thinking there was not in old-fashioned monetarist terms, so Milton Friedman, for example, would say in retrospect that what should have happened with the Great Depression, Wall Street crash in the US in the 20s and the 30s, was because there was this massive increase to hold money balances, the government or the Fed should have been increasing the money supply. In fact, the money supply shrank rapidly, all of the banks collapsed, and then you were thrown into this depression. There was a danger that was going to happen after the financial crisis, and that was part of the justification for quantitative easing. But they weren't thinking in just those terms. They weren't thinking in quantity terms. They were actually thinking, how do we shift people's asset portfolios? It was the portfolio balance theory of monetary policy. I think Ben Bernanke was a big proponent of this. And it was basically to try and reduce the returns on low-risk assets to encourage people who wanted a return to take on more and more risk. And so you were trying to shift people through different asset classes in the hope that would create an economic stimulus. I think that was a very misguided way to go about it. But it also explains, to a certain extent, why that quantitative easing after the financial crisis didn't lead to a big boost of inflation, because it wasn't structured that way. It was mostly going on to bank balance sheets and making certain assets extremely cheap in an unproductive way, and then that would have trickle-down effects elsewhere. But of course, when you got to COVID, we realized that it doesn't always work that way. Yep. Sometimes, if you print a lot of money, if you borrow a lot of money, if you pump a lot of money into the economy, that does go through into real economic activity with a lag and a very kind of violent whiplash effect here, given that we were all locked down, not allowed to do anything for 18 months, it felt like in the UK. People were building up sort of balances of cash, and then suddenly You open it up, everyone starts spending. Wow, what a surprise. Here comes massive inflation.
Yeah.
Of course, it wasn't a surprise because some of the people I work with were looking at monetary statistics at the time, 18 months in advance, and saying, no, hold on. We're seeing sort of 25% growth in the broad money supply. There is no way this doesn't lead to significant double-digit inflation down the line. But people didn't listen. People said, no, this is old-fashioned, antiquated thinking.
And
well, we saw what happened.
When the knock-on effect is people have less disposable income.
Yep.
Local businesses are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
People have lost their homes. There's an increase of homelessness, increase in alcoholism, increase in drug addiction, massive increase in shoplifting. All the effects, the societal effects have come off that. And people are now starting to think that the UK is a bit of a dump. I mean, we've got a poor international reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, look, friends of mine only see the Twitter version of the UK, and I try to say to them, it's not as bad as that, but it is bad.
Yeah.
I mean, we went into two things from this. We went into our local Sainsbury's the other night. One bag of stuff. We're making dinner. Get some things for breakfast. It's literally one bag, and it was £42. And I was like, it's like in my head, how I spent £42 here? I've got a steak. I've got some pasta. I've got some croissants for the morning. Like, that was probably my mum's weekly shop.
Yeah.
Like with a whole trolley when I was a kid. I was like, how have we got to this state? But also we had this weird thing whereby when I went to get the steak off the shelf, pulled it out, and there was this large beep in the store. I was like, what was that? Was that me? And it went off again. I spoke to the girl who works there. She said, oh, we've had so much shoplifting and they steal the meat and they steal the chocolates. It's now a warning alarm when it comes off the shelf. Not when they leave the store without paying, when it comes off the shelf.
When it comes
and
off
I was
the
like,
shelf.
the fuck are we doing here? Where are we at?
Yeah.
And the start of the conversation with Connor on the way down today, I said, I think we're in trouble at the moment. If we don't see a radical shift, we are heading towards, like, we have symptoms of South Africa. Yeah, we have symptoms of a complete collapse in society. We run businesses. It's hard out there. And I don't see anything coming from the Labour government where me as a business operator, business owner thinks, oh, this is incentivizing me to open more businesses, and my business is going to be fine. It's like, shit, how do we make this stuff work? It's hard out there.
Yeah, and I think some of the stuff you're talking about, we have become more tolerant of crime and disorder and squalor. And so I think there are economic angles to that, but I also think there are kind of policing angles and also just about the expectations we set as society and what we tolerate and what we don't.
But don't you think that's all downstream of the economy?
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
I think it's heavily downstream of the economy. I think you could probably combine, if you wanted to, and you obviously wouldn't, an economy that wasn't going great, but also with a high degree of social order. And maybe you can look at Japan, for example, there and say, still very orderly, still very clean, and they've had a very long economic stagnation, culturally different and everything else. But I do think we should have higher standards and higher expectations and better law enforcement in the UK. But you're absolutely right. So much of this, and indeed the attitude shift itself, comes from thinking things are going really badly. We're not the country that we once were. You lose that sense of optimism. You lose that sense of dynamism, and you just sort of accept decay around you. Physical decay, but sort of spiritual decay and every other kind of decay as well. And that's a huge problem. And this is why I always think, it's not just about economic statistics. It is about people leading meaningful, fulfilling lives.
Yeah.
And if we get stuck in this downward spiral, that's a huge problem. But I also, I try to be an optimist.
Yeah.
And
I am an optimist.
I am an optimist about the long-term future, and you have to, I suppose, to be optimistic about the long-term future, you have to be willing to be quite pessimistic about the moment you find yourself in now and think, actually, we need radical change. And without it, things are going to go badly. You need that to kind of get you over the edge to actually do something, right? But I think we've got a huge amount of potential in the UK. And I think people tend to talk us down a little bit too much, actually. Because if you look at our underlying advantages and just our location and our history and our culture and our financial and professional services industries and our kind of tech and education and science that we have in the UK, we have London.
Brexit, I would put Brexit in that.
With Brexit in the sense that it's an opportunity, actually to forge our own way and do things in a radically different sense. Yeah, absolutely. But I think in the modern economies, cities are more and more important. And in London, we have what should be and what would have been without government intervention, the greatest city in the world, beyond question. We'd be kicking New York's butt in American terms if the government hadn't constrained London so severely after the Second World War.
Hey, I still think it's the greatest city in the world. I mean that.
I would rather live here than anywhere else.
Yeah, I'm going to New York next week, and I love New York.
Yeah.
But London is very special to me. My biggest problem in London at the moment is really the crime, the open stealing of people's phones and things like that. But I think that's easily solved. I think London is the greatest city in the world.
Yeah.
I'm sticking with it.
Good. Well, there we go. So cities are super important.
Yes.
We have a fantastic city, which is time zone-wise situated perfectly. You can trade west and east simultaneously. We have the English language, which is a huge asset. We've got so much that I think we should be grateful for and I think we should capitalise on in the UK. We just have to understand kind of what we're good at and pursue it. And instead, I think that we're in this situation in the UK where we would say, for example, well, we don't really like bankers and private equity. Let's try and clamp down on that a little bit. Or we're pretty fed up with London taking all the spoils. Let's constrain London and try and shovel taxpayers' money elsewhere. By the way, I'd love the rest of the country to boom as well. But I think we're in this situation where we're trying to rethink what we are and how we do it. And this is basically so often the motto of the very interventionist left. Mm-hmm. They just don't like modern capitalism. They don't like the country that they live in. They want everything to be completely different. And they want to basically design a utopia and impose it on the rest of us. And I'm not saying that it has to be London or it has to be financial services or it has to be AI or anything else. I'm saying let's be neutral. Let's create the best possible environment for people to pursue their ambitions, for people to get investment for amazing projects, for businesses to grow and thrive and employ people and everyone else and everything else. And I'm totally open about where this ends up. The point is we can't plan it. And if we try to predetermine it, or if we try to say, I don't like the outcomes of the free market process here, couldn't we have something different that accords more with my sensibilities? We're hamstringing ourselves. And we will never get anywhere. We won't break out of this kind of morass that we're in with those kind of attitudes. You have to be, I think, a little bit freewheeling about everything. You have to say, business is dynamic, markets are dynamics. As individuals, we all have our own ideas and preferences and ambitions, and let's let us pursue them and see what happens and help that process to work, not try and second guess it at every turn.
But if you're right, and I believe you're right, I assume we will agree on 90-95% of things.
Probably.
The big challenge we have is to educate and kill these ideas of centralization, central planning, broadly left-wing ideas. And many people on the left are adamant and of the firm belief that they're right about how society should be constructed, despite the fact that history has taught us again and again and again that central planning doesn't work. Ultimately, it leads to economic decline and societal decline. There are people who believe, we just haven't done it in the right way. We haven't had the right type of communism. But and I observe it quite clearly now, where I see this demonization of wealth, demonization of business, demonization of billionaires, millionaires. yet the lack of understanding of the things you want to pay for come largely from the people who create that.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of the biting the hand that feeds you. And when we talk about, so for example, I saw a debate around reform wanting to privatise large parts of the NHS. And look, I'm proud of the NHS and see its massive failings at the same time. So much so that I don't use it unless I have to because of circumstance. But I'm not ashamed to use it because I've paid for it. But at the same time, I use the private system when I can because it's a better service. Demonstrably, infinitely better service. It's like flying Ryanair to first class in Emirates. It's a vastly different.
I wish I knew.
Well, to be honest, I haven't flown first class in Emirates, but somebody I was with the other day told me about the first time they had a shower on a plane. I was like, that sounds cool. But it's demonstrably different. But that shift, especially right now in our country, to try and explain, and I think it's coming naturally. So I've been out to Argentina, I've been out to Venezuela. When you're put through harsh economic pain, you see the world in a different way because you have to. You have to manage your money in a different way. When it's like this slow death we live here, I think some people are afraid to depart from their ideology. But trying to sell free markets, the idea that actually the health outcomes might be better with a more private insured health system, it's so hard to sell this to people. I can think of people very close to me right now that I can't even get them to consider it.
Yeah.
And so it comes to a point, it's like, do we have a revolution, we push it through, or do we spend time educating people? I think it's such a challenge.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm so glad you said that because that ultimately is what the Institute of Economic Affairs is all about. Now, obviously, we do policy research and we come up with ideas and reform plans for different areas of policy. And mostly they advance the market and the role of individual responsibility and kind of try and roll back the state and bureaucracy and everything else. But I think we're...
Can I ask a question on
that?
Yeah,
Sorry. Please.
The Institute of Economic Affairs, where does your foundations come from? Because I studied economics at school.
Yeah.
And I clearly remember a whole term of Keynesian economics.
Yeah.
But, Keynes being a constant during my 2 years of A-level economics. I'd never heard of Austrian economics until I discovered Bitcoin. And it was like this whole new world of economics. I wasn't introduced to Adam Smith in my A-levels. I wasn't introduced to Hayek, to Friedman, all these other economic thinkers. It just didn't exist. So I know there'll be economists who are working with the government who are Keynesians. Where does your think tank, how does it establish its framework of economic thinking? Where does it come from?
I mean, I think our framework comes from the classical economists, so starting with Adam Smith and on through the Austrian school and people like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and then many of the sort of great Nobel Prize winning economists of the 70s and the 80s and everything as well. So that there is this strain of classical economics that goes back hundreds of years, but it's still a very, kind of lively intellectual tradition as well. And now, of course, this was what economics was, or actually they tended to call it political economy rather than economics per se, when this was sort of the dominant way of thinking about things. And that lasted more or less up until the First World War. It was never put into, pure practice because everything is a compromise and there are always competing interest groups. But broadly speaking, economics as a discipline or political economy was in those free market terms. So it was all about how the market works and how resources are allocated and so on. And there was a very limited role for government within that. There was a role for government, but it was limited. Now, I think with the massive growth of government that you got with the First World War, and then with, in the US, the Depression, with Keynes who sort of his economics changed over time. And then I think actually he was completely bastardized after his time and after his death by so-called Keynesians and post-Keynesians who probably were pursuing economic policies that Keynes would not have thought consistent with a free society, that went much further than he himself necessarily would have wanted to go. But the economics profession totally changed. And so in the interwar period, and then you had massive growth of government again in the Second World War, you had the growth of socialism, communism at the same time. You had a huge intellectual movement essentially towards planning, towards thinking that you should put the enlightened intellectuals in charge. You should let them decide. We can't afford in this new age to just let things fall where they may.
This is the managerial class.
This is still the managerial class. So you had to have direction and you had to have plans and you had very strong versions of this, like a communist 5-year plan, or you had relatively weaker versions of this, like just the economic planning that you had in the UK, where you were sort of trying to fine-tune the economy in real time. And there was thought that, you could achieve full employment and growth if you just had the right mix of monetary policy and fiscal policy. And sometimes you'd have to increase taxes, sometimes you'd have to increase spending, interest rates, etc. This kind of fine-tuning model, it completely broke down in the post-war period, or it took a while, but in kind of the late 60s, then in the early 70s, it broke down. Now, the point of the IEA, ultimately, the reason that we were founded is because some people in the wake of the Second World War started to worry about the kind of society we would have post-war. They didn't want this kind of total state that existed in wartime, for good reason, to continue. They were very worried about the advent of communism. They were very worried about economic planning and inflation and everything in the UK. They wanted to get back to what they regarded as a free society, where government had a role, but it was limited. And the onus was on us as individuals and as businesses and as families to do our own thing and to develop society the way that we wanted to. And ultimately, the point of the IEA was to keep those ideas alive at first, because they were so out of fashion. No one was interested in this stuff. And so the IEA is 70 years old this year. We started in 1955. And I think probably it took them about 20 years to think that they were really making intellectual progress. So they were trying to keep the ideas alive. They were trying to bring people together because there were still lots of people who believed in these things and who wanted to research them and work on them. But they were scattered around the country. Often they were in economics departments at universities. They would have felt very lonely because they were the last free marketeer standing in their university faculty or something. And one of the things the IEA did was say, no, you know what, actually, there's a lot of us. We may be spread out, but we can come together, we can commission projects, we can publish them, we can promote them, we can start to build an intellectual movement around these ideas again, and then hopefully things will shift, there will be an opportunity, and the pendulum will swing back in the opposite direction. And what I was going to say about the role of the IEA is we do the policy papers and we work out reforms, and that's all very kind of technical and useful, but I think we also do something a lot bigger than that as well. Now, our kind of founding story, our origin story, if you want to put it in very glamorous superhero terms, is our founder, Anthony Fisher, World War II hero, fighter pilot, reading Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the condensed version in Reader's Digest.
Which,
and
by the way, every kid should be given a copy of at school.
Every kid should be given a copy at school. We give away lots of copies, actually. It's still one of the books we print the most of. We have our own nice edition of it. But he read this story, which was about the growth of the state and the decline of freedom and the kind of tyranny that it could eventually lead to. And he said, this taps into my deep concerns about the direction of Britain in the post-war period. And so he went to see Hayek at the London School of Economics. And he said, Professor Hayek, I want to do something about this. I've been inspired by what you've written. Can you give me some advice? I'm thinking of going into politics. And Hayek basically said, don't waste your time going into politics. What happens in politics is already predetermined by the climate of ideas. What actually matters is trying to reach, Hayek called them second-hand dealers in ideas. You would be a second-hand dealer in idea. I'm a second-hand dealer in ideas. We're people who think about things and communicate them to others. And so Hayek's thing was, reach these people with reasoned argument, win them over to your cause, and that will create a different climate of opinion in the country. And then politics will follow, because politics is downstream of a country's intellectual culture rather than upstream of it. Now,
so you're using me to reach the masses with these ideas.
Maybe you're using me.
Maybe I am. No, but it's interesting because, we had Zia in here the other day.
Yeah.
One of the, I think, important questions I asked him was, a lot of people have talked about, and I find this hilarious, when they're, Keir Starmer or anybody comes out and says these unfunded policy ideas of reform.
Yeah.
And I question the funded policy ideas has put our government $3 trillion in debt. So that does make me laugh. But I said, he explained how they would fund them. Mm. But what about the 150 billion deficit we're running every year? What about that? These are big, important questions.
Yeah.
But to continue, maybe one day Nigel Farage will be sat there, or Kemi Badenoch. I would love Rachel Reeves or Angela Rayner. Mm. What I learn from you, what I take forward to them, I question to them. And what will happen is in that environment where, because I believe that the independent media is the most important media, of course, that enough people listening to this will also go, well, Angela Rayner didn't give a good answer to that question on free markets. But maybe Nigel Farage did give a good answer to that. Maybe he's going to look at tax reform, and that's going to influence the voting.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like, you're telling me, and I'm agreeing with you. Because I've considered going into politics, but every time I was like, I think I could be more helpful outside of it.
And maybe you'd be a great politician as well. But this kind of thing, I think, is incredibly
I don't know if that's
useful.
a compliment.
No, it might not be. It's backhanded, if anything, isn't it? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, the power-hungry narcissist.
But I think another thing that we've always said is that we can create the supply of ideas. We can't create the demand for them. And I think people have this idea that think tanks on the left and on the right are some sort of shadowy puppet masters secretly coordinating the direction of policy in the country. And obviously, selfishly, I wish that were the case, but it really isn't. We're trying to develop ideas, but we don't really determine whether politicians are going to pick them up. We don't determine if the circumstances are going to be right. We try to create a supportive intellectual climate so that when good ideas are needed, there is a sort of public constituency there for them. But it's a long-term process. It doesn't work the way people think that it works. And it's about these kind of conversations, and it's what's in the newspaper. But Hayek talked about the intellectuals. We need to win over the intellectuals who had become extremely socialist in that post-war period and make them kind of agree with the tenets of liberalism again. Liberalism in the old-fashioned sense of believing in freedom and individual initiative. And he thought that intellectuals were naturally more inclined towards socialism because they're smart people and they naturally think their ideas are better than others. And if only they were in charge of things, it would be better for everybody, Not so, it turns out. But he thought we had to win them round. But I think when people hear that term intellectuals, they think this is very ivory tower. And it's all about professors. And professors are great. We want to win over professors. But Hayek meant something much broader by intellectuals. He was talking about school teachers, clergymen, members of local business associations. He would have said people with social media followings, influencers, if they existed in podcasters, if they existed in his day. I think what we want to see, and this is not something that any one think tank can bring about or any one podcaster, but what we want to see is a culture in the country and a climate of opinion which is much more around individuals and freedom and what the private sector can do and what entrepreneurs can do than it is about what can the government do.
Well, look, I think we're in a position now where there is a huge amount of demand for something different. We've had what I deem as a terrible Tony Blair era, followed by a terrible Conservative era, which was actively being followed by a terrible Labour period. I think the low voter turnout, I think the apathy in society is all a reflection of this. Some people want something different. I've been accused of my podcast being a soapbox for like an open place for reform.
Right.
But the fact is, the reform people want to talk. They want to talk about ideas, and I'm being quite reserved. Even though I'll talk to the reform people, like can they solve this? Can they as a party solve this? But I do recognise the reason they've become popular is there's a complete distrust of the main two parties now that they can't fix any of these problems. But society, the trajectory of society at the moment is very negative. The economy is struggling. And so people want something different. And look, things felt good under the Blair era. It felt like a positive Britain felt. It felt good. I wouldn't vote for them. I never did. But I still recognise the country felt like it was in a good place. We're now in the opposite position. And I think the important job here is to get out and teach people these ideas and teach people why this will lead to a more prosperous society. We can blame the Conservatives or we can blame the Labour Party. I think it's just government that's been the problem. We have to teach these ideas that to get to a more prosperous society, lower poverty, higher employment rates, we need an economic system that allows it. It doesn't have to be left or right. It just has to be a better economic system. So I think the things you're talking about, there is a demand for it, but I don't think people know they have a demand for literally this.
I think you're absolutely right there. And I think we're at a really interesting moment in public debate in the UK at the moment. And reform is part of this because I think people are realising that what we have is broken in some fundamental way and they're yearning for change. but they don't know what that kind of change looks like yet. They might have some good ideas about what the change should look like. They might have some terrible ideas about what the change should look like. What I see as my job is to try and persuade people that the change they need is one that is rooted in kind of free markets and individualism, that it's not about, on the left, kind of government taking over the economy and sort of mission directing the private sector, or being even more socialist than that. Equally, though, it's not about kind of the strong man who, forget about the rule of law, forget about democracy, I know what to do and let's just get on and do it. These are both caricatures of extreme positions, but I think there is a tendency when people think things are broken to go in those directions. Because actually, if you're saying things are broken, what we need to do is get out of the way and let people flourish, people say, well, that's a lot to take on a leap of faith. So you do have to persuade them, and it's somewhat counterintuitive. And I think it was really interesting the way you put that in terms of we had a Conservative era and we had a Labour era, and now we've got, also we had Labour and we had Conservative, and now we've got another Labour era. In a way, it's all one era, right?
Well,
and I think
it's one era of drifting to the left.
One era of drift, and I think you can extend it back even further, actually, into the sort of tail end of the Conservative years before New Labour came in.
John Major. And
I think there are even probably mistakes made by the sainted Margaret Thatcher towards the end of her tenure as well. I mean, I think that you had, at the beginning of the 80s, a really radical project to liberate the economy and transform the state in the UK. And that, it wasn't perfect, didn't go as far as I wanted in many areas, and there are some things I might have done differently. But generally speaking, that was a good thing, in my view, through the 1980s.
Oh, and you weren't some 10-year-old being angry that they hadn't gone far.
No, to be fair, I wasn't even alive for part of that period.
Back.
So I'm reflecting back, exactly. I think one of the interesting things in policy and economics is looking at previous episodes of reform and change and everything else. So I do a lot of that, and I think about it. But yes, I was either very young or not alive for much of that. I think my first political memory was John Major becoming Conservative Prime Minister or something.
So you might be just a little bit younger than me. I remember Thatcher as a character,
right?
But I don't remember her as a leader. I remember Major as a leader.
Right. I'm absolutely convinced, by the way, that I saw the Berlin Wall coming down on the news.
Oh no,
with my parents.
No, I did.
I must have been really young when that happened.
Yeah.
And maybe it's one of those things you look back, and if you're kind of an anti-communist free marketeer, of course, one of the main memories of your childhood was seeing this wall coming down.
David Hasselhoff getting up and singing.
But I remember it quite vividly. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. But I think what we've seen over this period, and I think starting in the 90s and then carrying through Blair, Brown, Cameron, everything that came subsequently, right till now, is a particular type of government. And there were different political inflections put on it, of course. But I think what you've seen is basically the rise of managerialism and of bureaucracy. And I don't think that that's either left or right. I think, unfortunately, actually, that reforming government of the 1980s set in train a series of events and institutions and incentives which kind of led in a snowball effect to where we are now. And one very simple way of thinking about that is they privatized industries, but because they had been kind of nationalized monopolies, they were not competitive markets. You had to kind of artificially create competition and encourage its development. So you set up regulators. Now, these regulators were meant to have a time-limited existence. They were there to make these markets competitive, to gradually withdraw, and then they would sort of wither up and die. I think if you had told the people who set up the economic regulators that they would still be with us 35 years on. And what's more, something like Ofcom, which people said, it'll never need more than 40 or 50 employees. Does it have 1,000 employees or something now? Massive budget. It's trying to regulate the internet. It's trying to get into everything. These institutions took on a life of their own, and they built and developed a whole new class of people, really, of professionals who are in government, who are in bureaucracy. And whose status and livelihood comes from how much can they regulate, how much can they control. And this has just snowballed, as I said, to the point that what started as some fairly straightforward price regulation to try and encourage competition is now a massive regulatory superstate that is in everything. And makes everything difficult. And I mean, if you're in business,
would you call it bureaucratic tyranny?
I think bureaucratic tyranny is quite a good way to think of it, actually. Some of my friends talk about like anarcho-tyranny, that we simultaneously have the kind of social breakdown and disorder that you've talked about, and that basically bad actors are literally getting away with murder. But people who don't play by the rules just get away with so much. There is so much cheating the system, which goes unpunished. But at the same time, if you do the right thing, it's so difficult. You want to build your stadium.
Yes.
Or someone wants to bring their spouse in from overseas, who they're going to pay for, who's going to have a great job. Immigration, I think, is the classic example of this. People are so angry about illegal immigrants coming across on boats and the seeming impotence of government to do anything whatsoever about this. But my wife's American. I've got lots of friends who have foreign spouses or who've moved across borders. And these are people who are paying their own way, who are contributing. And it's so difficult for them. And the response to public anger about people being illegally smuggled into the country is not to stop that. It's to tighten up even more on the legal immigration, which actually is a net benefit to us.
I know. It's
and
crazy.
so you have the anarchy and the tyranny at once, and they're the wrong way around.
Yeah, it is. I find it so frustrating. And what I find really frustrating, again, I'm going to echo Connor a lot here because we talk about this every day. And he asks brilliant questions that sometimes I don't even have the answer to. But, you know, we would leave here and I would say, yeah, Tom was great. And Connor would say, yeah, he's great. And like all the ideas are great. It's all common sense. Why don't government do this? I mean, Keir Starmer, I assume, would like to get re-elected in 3 years. I'd like to have some positive press.
Yeah.
I think Rachel Reeves is the same. Why would they not sit down with you, with the Institute of Economic Affairs, and say, we got a problem here. What are the solutions? And you guys would sit back and say, look, it's going to be hard, but here's some ideas you can try. Why would they not do that? Because if that leads to a more prosperous society, it's going to lead to a more likely scenario where they get re-elected. Why are they avoiding this? Are they ideologically trapped? They literally cannot, their brains cannot compute these ideas. Are they fundamentally stupid? Like, I don't understand it. If I was to become a politician, if I was to become Prime Minister, and I wanted to have a very successful career and be remembered as a great Prime Minister, I would be trying to get the best experts I can find.
Yeah.
The people who have the pedigree and the track record and the understanding of history, understanding of how the economy works. Say, come and tell us, come and give us, help us. I just don't understand why we are where we are. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, look, I say all kinds of terrible things about politicians.
Yes.
Generally speaking, I have a low opinion of government and the people who staff it. But actually, I meet lots of politicians. And most politicians, believe it or not, are smart, well-intentioned people who want to do good things. And they may have ideological baggage that kind of frames their thoughts in a particular way and that makes them blind to maybe some of the avenues I would want them to pursue. But I think what you realise so much when you speak to politicians is how trapped they are by circumstance, by the institutions they operate in, and by the incentives that they face. So just to answer your question directly, what should Labour do if they come to us and say, we're in a tight spot, lads, how do we get out of it? I don't think it's that complicated. And I don't think it's necessarily right-wing or, outrageously free market, the stuff that they need to do. But the situation is basically this, right? The tax burden is already extremely high. Nobody wants to pay more taxes. They've gone after businesses at the last budget. That went very badly for them. They've promised that they won't go after individuals in any significant way. They are sort of stealthily going after individual taxes anyway. But it's going to be hard to squeeze much more blood from the stone there. On the other hand, spending is still much higher than the revenues they bring in. Growth is not good, so that trajectory is going to get worse, if anything. We have an aging population, which over the coming decades is going to add massively to the burdens on the state. Now, if we don't change policies whatsoever, over the next, I think it's 45 years, we're going to need to spend an extra 10, 11% of GDP. We're talking about maybe £200 billion in today's money just to look after old people. That's like we double everybody's income tax bill to roughly cover that.
It's a significant problem.
That's a problem. So they feel trapped. And, they have backbenchers with certain views. They have the trade unions with certain views. But there is a way out of this.
very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
By the way, are trade unions a significant problem?
I think they can be a significant problem. Trade unions, I think, are a valid and important part of a free society. You know, workers should be represented. And I think trade unions, actually, historically, trade unions provided some great services privately to their members, which we now think of as core functions of the state in Britain. So it's one of my favourite stats, but before the National Insurance Act came in I think 1911, when they first really started to extend the government's role in healthcare in the UK, 80% of male workers had health insurance through a trade union or a friendly society. Now, 80% of male workers, obviously, you want it to be more comprehensive and universal than that, but that's when, relative to today, we were a pretty poor country. We might have been rich compared with other countries at the same time, but it was a much lower degree of development and prosperity than we enjoy today. So there's an important role for trade unions. Now, I think when you give trade unions special legal privileges, which allow them to act with impunity or indeed with immunity from the consequences of those actions, you get an imbalanced situation. And I think maybe they have a little too much power and a little too much sway at the moment, which goes beyond the role that they would play in a free market. But I wouldn't talk about trying to clamp down on the unions or shut them down or anything. I just want kind of balance where people can negotiate freely without the state giving them any kind of special privileges. And actually, if we think about the Labour Party, Labour government, and we think about the unions who play an important role in that political movement, in that political party, sometimes the unions are on the side of the angels. Sometimes very much not, but sometimes they're on the side of the angels. So around net zero, for example, and some of the insane energy policies we're pursuing, which is making energy so expensive and leading to continued deindustrialisation and a loss of economic competitiveness, a lot of the unions are actually saying, no, this stuff is crazy and you are hurting jobs and you're hurting our members and you're holding the country back doing that. So it's a complex picture there. But I think what I was going to say was that there is a way out for Labour.
Does it start with tax policy?
I'll come to tax policy in a minute, but I actually don't think it does start with tax policy, because tax policy is hard when you need the revenue and you have the spending commitments. Okay. Now, I will always argue, and I'd love to get into this in more detail, that for any given amount of revenue, you can have better and worse tax systems. And we could have a tax system which was vastly better and vastly more pro-growth than the one we've got now, and that would raise roughly the same amount of money.
Flat rate tax?
That's possible. I'd love a flat rate tax. All of that stuff.
Was that John O'Connor brought that up with us?
I mean, his group, the Taxpayers Alliance, did a fantastic report. I think it was called The Single Income Tax a number of years ago. And that is a hefty book on tax policy reform. And I think you can still reasonably treat that as kind of a Bible of tax reform that would be worth pursuing if you had the opportunity to do it. Now, Labour aren't going to take that approach, but there's no reason at all why they couldn't radically deregulate, right? They could pursue genuine supply-side reform on energy, on housing, on financial services, on infrastructure, on a whole host of things. And I mean, you probably picked up on this in America. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have this book. Was it called Abundance?
Yes.
And it's about basically a liberalising agenda, a freedom agenda, if you like, for the left. And it's to say, just because we're progressive in our politics doesn't mean that we believe in bureaucracy and nobody being able to get everything done. You know, they would say we're on the side of progress and of human flourishing. We're not on the side of the bureaucrat.
And I almost feel like I'm getting that sense anyway from this Labour administration. They are talking quite significantly about planning reforms because, I mean, firstly, they want to build 1.5 million homes and they've realised that the planning process is preventing them achieve that target. Yeah. So I feel like that is coming from that Labour government.
The rhetoric is certainly coming, and I'm encouraged by the rhetoric. And I'm encouraged by things like Keir Starmer saying, Whitehall really has to shape up. Now, I think the funny thing with Keir Starmer is there is almost no one in British politics who is more a creature of the public sector bureaucracy than he is.
Yes.
And you've had David Starkey on this podcast, haven't you? And he has this line about we're in a situation where we have government of the bureaucracy, by the bureaucracy, for the bureaucracy.
It's brilliant.
And we've sort of reached end stage bureaucratic statism. And I see that, and I think it's a great way of putting it. And you would sort of expect Keir Starmer to be the epitome of that. Now, it seems like he's smarter than that suggests. He recognises the problems that they have in Whitehall. I actually think what happened with Labour getting off to such a bad start in government is that they had aspirations and they had a sense of these are the kind of things that we want to do, but they hadn't thought them through in detail. They believed in this kind of Rolls-Royce civil service, that it was just the evil Tories who weren't treating them properly or paying them enough or whatever that was causing the problem. That they could come in with some high-level aspirations of what they wanted to achieve, tell the civil service, this is what we want to do, let's do it. And these people would come up with the ideas and they would develop them, and you could just be sort of the chairman of the board with all the work going on underneath you. Now, it turns out, predictably, this was a fantasy.
Yes.
Civil service is very good at certain things, but they do not develop radical new ideas. You have to have that already. You have to have the plan when you come into government for what you want to do, and you have to be very directional with the civil service. It's also a myth, by the way, that the civil service is out to stop anything from happening. I think Michael Gove, and there were some things he did in government that I thought were great and some things that I didn't care for very much at all. But he was the most successful minister in terms of imposing his agenda on the departments he led. And I know people who worked with him, and they say it's very clear. You have to surround yourself with good people, but you also have to be very clear about what you want and sort of keep your foot on the gas pedal. If you're just airy-fairy about these things, they won't happen. You have to keep pushing and you have to hold the civil servants to account. But if you do that, they will do a very effective job of trying to implement. But you can't rely on them to come up with the ideas for you. You can't rely on them for radicalism. And this is just my theory. I haven't had this validated by people in government, although I have heard rumours to this effect from various people, that they just expected the civil service to give them the playbook and they could run with it. Didn't happen. So now they're doing something which is very difficult, which is trying to work out an agenda while they're in government and while they're having all of these different issues thrown at them day after day, and while they're trapped in the 24-hour news cycle and they're looking at opinion polls and all of this stuff. That's the wrong time to come up with ideas, but that's where they are now. The better time is to come up with all your ideas in advance and have a really clearly worked out plan for what you want to do. Anyway, they are where they are, but I think they can look at this movement from the left in America towards abundance, towards supply-side liberalisation, towards getting rid of all of the bureaucratic roadblocks that stand in the way at the moment, and think this is how we get growth. And as soon as we get growth, all of our other problems become that much easier to deal with. There are people who are thinking about this stuff on the left in the UK. In a way, it's a shame that deregulation and a kind of abundance agenda is too associated with the right in Britain, when it really shouldn't be. This should be something that we can all get behind. Yeah, exactly. Because we want progress, we want prosperity. We may disagree on the precise means of getting there. But I don't think anyone, almost no one, has this idea that what we really need is greater bureaucracy.
I think it's a neutral position.
Yeah.
I mean, the only people who may want more bureaucracy are the people who live in and benefit from the bureaucracy.
Right.
Listen to this great podcast this week that Elon Musk shared out, which was how bureaucracy is killing civilization or Western countries. I'll dig it out and send it to you.
Yeah, please.
It's incredible. It really opened my eyes to how we built up this bureaucratic state. Actually, it followed on from what you said. It mainly came after the Second World War, where I think it was like 90% tax and government took over all the industries to try and rebuild the country. And there was like some logic behind it, but essentially built this bureaucratic state that we've never got away from.
Yeah. The funny thing is, by the way, the Americans did it on purpose. And so it actually really started, I think, with Woodrow Wilson and the progressive movement. So between the wars, if anything, and then it obviously ramped up over time. But they set out to create this administrative state and to transfer far more power from elected representatives to technocrats, to sort of the enlightened overseers of society, to the experts, if you like. And they believed naively, but truly in the sort of perfectibility of human society. And they thought with enough expertise and just enough intervention, we could end up in a really fantastic place. And that was what American progressivism really was about. But they had whole kind of doctrines about the administrative state, and they went about it very intentionally, building it up over time. In Britain, this is very British. we did it completely by accident. No one sat down to create the bureaucratic state that we have today. It simply evolved over time by the accumulation of different decisions and incentives and actually kind of benign or malign neglect of government.
Is it a cultural thing? Like we're happy to stand in queues and not complain? It's not complaining.
It's probably something to do with it, yeah.
Okay, so massive deregulation, strip back the bureaucratic state. And I'm with you. I don't think anyone could argue against that.
And so then we have cheap energy. The thing I didn't mention before was, financial regulation. We do need to free up the financial sector massively because it's no coincidence that growth pretty much came to a halt after the financial crisis. I think the issue there is we massively constrained the availability of credit. We've been in a credit crunch which never ended. Equally, though, we haven't allowed, or maybe it wasn't going to happen, or maybe we've just made it too difficult for it to happen, the kind of really big venture capital, private equity stuff to emerge in the UK the way it does in America. America has got away with its post-financial crisis regulation, which is quite similar to ours, because they've got thousands of small regional banks which aren't big enough to qualify for this very strict regulation. They also have, massive amounts of VC and everything else, lots of equity finance. In Britain and in Europe, we're too reliant on bank funding, which we have constrained, and we haven't allowed the alternatives to emerge in sufficient scale. So we're stuck. We don't have enough investment. We don't have enough private sector growth. That's one of the big problems. So yeah, absolutely. Build more, cheaper energy, more capital for business, and yeah, freedom for entrepreneurs to not have to worry about hiring people because of all of the labour laws that come along with it and everything else. Just free everything up.
What's your most radical ideas that you think about? Idea or ideas?
Yes. Goodness me. I mean, I'm pausing because I think to ordinary people, so much of what I think about is wacky and really radical. I think let's talk about the NHS. You already brought it up. And it really is a bit of a sacred cow in Britain that, you can't talk about changing the NHS. Now, I think that's changing a little bit because I think people's eyes increasingly are open to the deficiencies of the NHS. And hopefully the message that we've been trying to get out there for a long time, that you don't have to look at a completely free market option. Look across Europe.
Yeah, don't look at America.
Well, and America's a long way from a free market as well. I mean, the crazy thing in American healthcare, they actually spend more as a percentage of GDP. The government spends more in America as a percentage of GDP on healthcare than most European countries do, than we do. Then they spend a massive amount privately too. And for some people, that leads to fantastic outcomes. I do think in some respects, the rest of the world free rides on a broken American healthcare system because there is so much money in it. That's part of the reason why you get all of this innovation and all of the new drugs being developed and everything else. So there are positive spillovers that American healthcare consumers are paying for, right? But that is a very problematic system. And there are all kinds of ways that government has intervened over the years to massively drive up costs in American healthcare.
I get weirded out by American healthcare. So whenever I travel across, so if I'm staying in a hotel, I'll put the TV on and they obviously have advertising for pharmaceutical industry, which we don't get. I don't think we get anywhere.
No.
And I'm always seeing adverts for drugs for conditions I didn't even know exist. I almost feel like the advert's trying to convince me I've got a condition that didn't even exist.
Yeah.
And it will advertise this problem and say, we've got this drug. And then at the end, there's this 30-second, very fast-spoken warning that it may lead to suicide, depression, death, cancer, this. And I'm like, what the fuck is this all about? So the innovation is great, but in some ways there's too much innovation. It's trying to find things that don't exist. And I find their system really weird. And also, I have this heart condition. It's called SVT, where my heart goes crazy sometimes. It's happened once in America, and it's happened a few times in the UK. I get in the UK, I get a blood test, I get measure my heart rate, and I get sent home. In America, it was similar, but I had certain drugs I had to take at the end of it because of the huge paranoia around litigation. Yeah. And it was like, hold on, we've got two different countries, but we both speak the same language. We feel similar in many ways. Why am I getting a vastly different treatment for the same condition there than here? And it was very weird. It was very weird to compare the two. I don't want the American system. Actually, we've got an interview coming out tomorrow with a guy guy contacted me from Switzerland. He was like, I'm hearing all the problems you talk about. I need to come and tell you about Switzerland. And he told me about their healthcare system.
Yeah.
Which has problems, but seems better than ours.
I think Switzerland is a good model. Probably the one in Europe I like the most is the Netherlands.
Okay.
But there are good examples abound. I mean, maybe we can look at Australia as well and think cultural similarities, very similar starting points, very similar, tax setups and everything. And they just have a much more pluralistic system. So it's not so state dominated. Many more people take out private insurance.
Well, you have to, don't you?
Yeah, it's a mixed market, basically. The Dutch system is essentially everyone takes out health insurance. The package you get is regulated. The price is regulated. So standard price, standard coverage. If you can't afford it, the government will subsidise it for you, pay for it for you. But you take this out from a range of competing private providers. So
there's competition.
Insurers. So there's competition. There's competition to insure you, and then there's competition as well to provide the services. But this is not a kind of free-for-all where people are dying in the gutter because they don't have health insurance. That's not true of America either, by the way, even though it might be the sort of common myth of America. But there are all sorts of ways to arrange healthcare in a more market-oriented way, which still has government support for people who can't afford it, which still guarantees universal access. It can, although I actually don't think this is necessarily a good thing, guarantee that things will be free at the point of use. I think free at the point of use is good for when you need like a big surgery or something, and you don't want people thinking, well, I'm going to put this off because I need to get together the cash, and then they could just get sicker and sicker, and ultimately that can be more expensive than treating them swiftly. But I do think that having sort of some little bit of friction, so you don't get the same people going to their GP every day with the same complaints and all of this kind of thing. You want people to be price conscious in healthcare in an ideal world. Now,
we have a high street doctor surgery that popped up.
Right.
I can't remember, a few years ago, Con? The Medic Clinic? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Medic Centre. So I phoned up for a doctor's appointment. Oh, it was still 3 weeks. I was like,
yeah.
I was like, I'll
either be better by then.
Or dead.
Yeah.
I don't know which one it is. And so I said, don't worry about it. And I forgot about it for a few days. I ended up telling a friend. They said, go to the Medic Clinic. It's £50 an appointment. And I phoned them up. I got an appointment that day. Most of the time, they can squeeze you in that day, but maybe the next day. It's £50 for an appointment. It's nice when you go in.
Yeah.
It's clean. It's modern. It feels like you're paying for a service.
Yeah.
And it feels like they want to give a good service. It feels like they know if they don't give you a good service, that you may go elsewhere. It's small. The doctor gets to know you, understand. So when I go and see them now, hopefully not too regularly, but they know about me. They know my background. They know my diet. They know, my challenges, whatever. But when I would go to the NHS, it would be a different doctor. They didn't really know me. And look, £50 might be a lot of. I understand I can pay that, and some people might find that really difficult. But a lot of people can afford it who don't realise they can afford it or don't realise it exists.
Yeah.
And so I think the same's in Ireland. That they have the equivalent of the NHS, but you still have to pay for your doctor's appointments. And it's that little bit of friction that stops people just going continually.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think that's exactly. And by the way, private GPs and so on have become far more freely available and far cheaper over recent years, I think, than they used to be, because there's this demand for them, and so people have responded to it in an entrepreneurial way. And a lot of private health insurers will give you free access to an online GP and that kind of thing as well. That can be useful.
But they've also innovated.
Yeah.
So you go our private GP practice, you can go for a infusion of B12 or an infusion of various vitamins, and so they've innovated in other ways to bring other revenue in outside of just emergency or general kind of illness care. Actually, they promote health. They promote the other side of medicine.
Yeah, absolutely right. And a lot of people will look at this and say, "Isn't this terrible? The NHS is falling apart, and all of these people are being forced to go private. We need to do something."
Oh, it's good.
Now,
It's proven
we
a
do
point.
need to fix the NHS in a variety of ways, but I also think we should lean into this shift towards a mixed market and say, as they do in Australia and elsewhere, a lot of people actually can afford to pay. They're already paying through their taxes, of course, that's part of the problem, but people can nevertheless afford to pay for healthcare. They might want to pay for healthcare why not let them? Why not make it a little bit easier for people to go private, to take some of the burden off the NHS? And maybe actually without doing a kind of big bang policy reform, we just end up in a situation where it's much more mixed, where it's not just all government run. You've got a bigger private market, and you've got a state bit as well. I will tell you in a second, by the way, my really radical idea.
Okay, we'll come to that because I've got a question.
Yeah.
Do we know if national insurance all just goes straight to the NHS? Or does it go into a big pot and the government spends it?
We know, and the answer is it doesn't. There is no pot.
Okay, but is the money they bring in from the through national insurance lower than the cost of the NHS?
Let's see. Off the top of my head, I'm not actually sure.
Okay.
It's
I'm going
it's
somewhere
sort of
with
ballpark, yeah.
Like an incentive system, if you take out private healthcare, private medical, private doctors, and you only use those, could we offer a national insurance benefit? Could we reduce your national insurance?
This to me would be the way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's totally sensible. So you have a situation at the moment with private schools and the VAT going on them.
Yeah.
Now, actually, I think this is another one of my radical ideas, is that we should just have VAT at a flat rate on all goods and services. We shouldn't be picking out different things for differential tax treatment. Now, you have to offset that elsewhere in the tax system. I think that would provide a lot of money for some tax cuts that people would love. But I'd say apply this to private schools, and I promise I'm circling back to healthcare and your question in doing this. You could say, oh, it's terrible we've put VAT on school fees. In future, we're going to get rid of that. I would say a better option is to give people some kind of tax deduction for private school fees against their income tax, say, and it could be capped at the level of per pupil spend in the state sector. So if you put your kid in a private school, you have saved the taxpayer, whatever it is, maybe £7,000 a year or something. So you should get a £7,000 tax credit. Or it could be a little bit lower than that. You can shape it various ways. But this is a way of saying, because you have not cost the state this amount of money, which you've paid for through your taxes, we're going to give you a little bit of tax benefit over there and make it easier for people to shift into the private market if they want to. You can do something similar with healthcare.
Sorry, just on that, because you're netting out a better position.
Yeah.
If private school's £20,000 and somebody can't afford that, but maybe with the tax, the tax benefit of £5,000, that nets out of £15,000 to them. You're going to drive a private sector.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing.
I agree.
Right? And I think it's a good thing in healthcare as well. So that same principle, working out when people choose to take out private insurance or to register with a private GP, it's a bit more complicated because healthcare costs are not as standardized as they are in education. So it's a bit more difficult to say you're saving the NHS this amount of money, so here is the corresponding tax credit. But that is absolutely the kind of approach that we should be taking to make it easier for people to reduce the strain on the government.
But the counter argument that we hear is, well, Nigel Farage is only talking about privatising parts of the healthcare. He wants to destroy our NHS because he wants to sell off parts of the NHS to his rich friends.
Yes.
This is what we hear. This is the argument over and over again.
Yeah. See, what I would like, and this is where it gets really radical, I don't think the government has any real role in the provision of healthcare. This should be an entirely private enterprise. And people say, oh no, it can't be private, it's too important. It's because it's so important that I think it has to be private and it has to be market driven.
Yeah.
The degree of complexity and scale in healthcare is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
These are epically large, epically complicated industries. And I know that it seems like common sense. Well, because it's complicated, because it's huge, you need some bureaucrats to be in charge of it. No. It's when you have complexity and when you have scale that you need decentralization. You need a functioning price system to allocate resources.
You need the invisible hand.
You need the invisible hand to tell people where to invest. You've got particular demand for this kind of healthcare treatment. That's where more money needs to go. Now, the government will inevitably have a role in healthcare. There's bound to be some sort of regulatory quality assurance role.
Fair.
I would argue that the more competitive the market is, the less you need that, but people are going to want some kind of backstop. Understood. And people are also going to want to know that if they fall on hard times, they will be covered. So you don't want a situation where people are denied healthcare because they're too poor or because they lost their job or whatever it is. So you do have to have the government playing some role in saying, we will help you to participate in this important private market. So according to how limited your means are, we will provide a subsidy that guarantees you a minimum level of health coverage. But that basically is the extent of the state's role. And could you call that a national health service? It might be stretching it a little bit. You could certainly call it a national health guarantee. Maybe if we'd started with a national health guarantee. And in fact, we wanted to start with a national health guarantee. That wasn't the terminology, but I referred before, I think, to the 1911 and then 1918 National Insurance Acts, which started to increase the government's role in healthcare. And I talked about how all those decades ago, 100 years ago or more, we had quite a well-developed private healthcare system, charitable healthcare system, a trade union-friendly society, kind of voluntary aid healthcare system in this country. Originally, government's thinking was, we just want to help these things to expand and to cover more people. And the really funny thing about this, and there's a guy called David Green, who a long time ago used to work for the Institute of Economic Affairs. He then set up his own think tank called Civitas. But he wrote a great book many years ago. I think it was called Working Class Patients and the Medical Establishment. And what he found was the reason healthcare went the way it went, with doctors largely becoming employees of the state, was because that was what the doctors wanted. They thought that was preferable to having to be employed by the working class.
And now they're striking for pay rises.
But this was essentially a way for the British Medical Association. They didn't want their members who were educated and who were at least upper middle class or maybe higher class than that in a very class-driven society. They didn't want to be the employees of trade unions or associations of, pit miners or whatever it was. They would much rather be public servants to be employed by the state. And that was where this initial pivot towards, no, we won't subsidise the private market, we will create a government market. And bit by bit, that led to the mass nationalisation after the Second World War.
Right.
But this is a kind of fascinating history that I think everyone involved would probably deny now. The politicians, if they were still around, would say, no, we always intended to create the glorious National Health Service. And the doctors would say, no, we had no problem being employed by working class people. But that's the truth of what happened back around the time of the First World War.
I think it's the hardest thing to sell, reform to the NHS.
Yeah, but it's getting easier because people see the downsides, and I think people are seeing more and more that it works better in other countries.
Of course, yeah.
And actually, we spend as much as those other countries now. Tony Blair could say in the 2000s, well, we just need to spend as much as the average European country, and then we will have healthcare outcomes as good as them. The outcomes haven't got better, and we're spending more than the average European country now.
So on this podcast, you are definitely hearing me talk about Bitcoin a lot. Well, why? We live in a really strange time with governments driving inflation with their reckless spending and endless money printing. There is a way out of this. There is a way to protect your money, and that is by stacking Bitcoin. I've made loads of shows about Bitcoin. You can go and research this. You can go and read the books. But the truth is, it is the hardest money ever created. If you are interested in protecting your financial future, it's time for you to get on the Bitcoin train. I've been stacking Bitcoin personally and through my businesses since 2017. It's protected me, it's secured my family's future, and it also strengthens all of my businesses. So if you want to start stacking Bitcoin, where do you do it? Well, for me, it's with Gemini. They're a fully licensed, full reserve exchange and custodian, so they give you a secure way for you to buy and own your Bitcoin. There's no risks and no funny business. So if you're serious about stacking Bitcoin the right way, head over to Gemini.com, which is GEMINI.com. And is this your most radical idea?
This has got to be among the most radical ideas to get the government out of healthcare altogether. I mean, we already talked about the planning system and basically just the government stepping back from that completely and letting building occur subject to some very simple guidelines where the market demands it. That's a complete change of mindset in the UK. So that's pretty radical too.
I've got radical ideas on taxation as somebody who has a high tax burden and will certainly sound like somebody who's just trying to avoid high tax. But I would eliminate business rates in town centres. I think they strangle, they're a choke point on new business. It's too hard. I would eliminate stamp duty. There was a house that came up in Bedford near where I live that I wanted to buy. We only moved 3 years ago. The only reason we wouldn't even consider it is because we face paying stamp duty again, which essentially eliminates half of what I paid as my deposit for that house. I haven't even had a chance to experience the gains. So when I realised, okay, that's stopping social mobility, I would eliminate inheritance tax. I would be happier with a flat rate tax, which is more of a burden than me, and get rid of all these supplementary taxes. Because what I've experienced now is that all these taxes are holding back me doing things that I think are good for the economy. Like, I am a businessman. I want to build businesses, and I'm just like, what? It's too hard. There's too many regulations. I've got to risk too much capital for very little return, and all the benefits have been stripped out for a business owner. So I think I'm very keen on massive tax reform, not just to benefit me to pay less tax, because I want to create more business. So I'd even put it quite like even a more radical approach would be, okay, give me tax breaks to create new businesses.
Yeah.
Just give me tax breaks to create new businesses. I was reading this article about the Estonian miracle. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't, I'll forward it to you. But it talked about after the fall of the Iron Curtain, Estonia was struggling, and they went to a flat rate tax, and it revolutionized their economy. I mean, I've been out. Have you been out to Estonia?
I haven't. No.
It is incredible. And I can imagine you can step across the border into Russia and it's depressing, but it's incredible. The country is like, it feels more energetic than the UK.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, Estonia famously has the most competitive tax system in the world. From a free market perspective, no one arranges their tax system better than Estonia. So the Tax Foundation, which is a great US-based think tank, they do this annual report called the International Tax Competitiveness Index. And it ranks all the countries of the OECD, which I think is 37 or 38 countries at the moment. Britain is sort of in the 30s. So we're maybe like the late 20s, the early 30s. Estonia is number one. Estonia is always number one because they have some fantastic characteristics to their tax system. So a relatively low flat rate of tax on income. They have what's called a distributed profits tax instead of a traditional corporation tax. So essentially, tax is only paid when it's distributed to shareholders. If you retain the profits within the company and you reinvest them, totally okay, no tax on that. So that is as pro-investment as a tax code can be. Lots of other nice aspects to that tax system as well. And I've spent quite a lot of time looking at different tax systems around the world and comparing them with Britain's tax system. And what's interesting about that is two things, I suppose. The first is, even Estonia isn't the perfect tax system. I can look at that and think, well, I'm not sure about that element. So, for example, their social security taxes, their equivalent of national insurance, very high. And so there's a kind of stealth tax there, and there's a wedge on employment. And that's an unfortunate thing, but you've got to balance up different unfortunate things in every tax system. But what's interesting, right, is so many tax systems have these really great elements that you could copy. Almost everything you would want to do in terms of tax reform, somebody else has done it already, and you can look at it and how it works and how it was implemented and the impact that it's had. The other thing when you look at other tax systems around the world is it makes it very clear where Britain falls down. And so you referred to one of them when you said business rates and stamp duty already. We have, I would say, probably the worst property tax system in the developed world.
I'm not surprised.
Right? It's almost as though you set out to raise money in the most economically destructive way possible. And actually, even if you set out with that objective, I'm not sure that you'd immediately have got to something as bad as our system of property taxes in the UK. We raise more than almost any other country from taxes on immovable property, so on real estate. And we do it in a way that just messes with economic incentives so massively. So business rates is a huge burden. Where I would depart from you on that is I don't want to kind of take it away for some businesses. I think we've got to get it as low as possible for all businesses and eventually try and eliminate it altogether.
I'm not opposed to that.
But it's a big chunk of revenue. I mean, one of the things I think of with taxes is you want to be neutral. You don't want to favour some types of business or some types of location over others. I think that's a principle that's worth trying to adhere to across the system as you're reforming it.
So you don't want incentive, because I think of my town centre.
Yeah.
I think of the boarded up shops. I see businesses open 6 months later, they're dead. And I look at the business rates, and I look at it, by the way, the weird incentive there. If your store, your shop is below a certain size, you don't pay business rates.
Right.
So what happens is people make their shops smaller.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. We're incentivizing destruction of, and I just look at the state of these town centres. I was like, if you can make it an economic zone of development, then you could reduce, just eliminate the business rates. You will get people creating businesses in these dying towns. But then I see your point. It's like, okay, let's get rid of that.
I mean, I'm open to that.
Yeah.
If you have very serious fiscal constraints, so this is like sort of the free ports idea or the enterprise zones ideas. I like them in that they can be proof of concept for stuff that you would want to apply to everybody and to everything. I don't like them if it's a sense of, it's allowing you to get away with worse policies and higher taxes in the rest of the country because you have these specific zones where you're letting things happen. So if you take the sort of very specific incentives and the narrowly targeted stuff, and you use that as, say, a pilot to prove that when you have lower taxes, you get a lot more economic activity and things start to flourish, that's great. But then you've got to generalize it. I always think the goal is a set of incentives which are good incentives and which encourage business and encourage investment and all of that, but that are neutral to everybody. And so the least neutral tax we have, you mentioned it as well, stamp duty. The havoc that wreaks on our housing market, I think, is massive. And so I want to do an equivalent study in the UK, because there isn't one as far as I know, but in Australia a number of years ago, they did this analysis of their tax system and they were working out, and apologies for the jargon, the marginal excess burden of all of their different taxes, simplified versions of their taxes. And so the marginal excess burden is how costly is this tax in economic and social terms over and above the revenue that you raise from it. So obviously, if you have a tax that raises 10 billion, that's a 10 billion cost to the economy, right? Because you're taking the money from the private sector and it's going over here to the government. But there is always an excess burden as well. And so they found, for their version of stamp duty, which by the way isn't nearly as bad as ours, or wasn't as bad as ours at the time, 78p in every pound raised in revenue. Right? That is way beyond any other tax that raises a significant amount of revenue in terms of the harm that it does. And the worst thing about stamp duty is it would be terrible if we had a functioning housing market where we were building millions of new houses and it was responsive to demand and we didn't have these massive supply constraints. Because what stamp duty does, you express this very well, it prevents transactions which would otherwise have happened from happening. If that happens systematically across an economy, you end up with massive misallocation. So the wrong people effectively are living in the wrong properties, or the wrong businesses are occupying the wrong properties. A functioning market is one where resources are owned by the people who place the highest value on them. And so if you have lots of transactions, you have lots of liquidity, that is where you will tend to end up. If you put massive transaction costs in place, if you stop so many of these transactions from happening, you get massive misallocation. And when you have allocation problems and very constrained supply, you have an absolute nightmare on your hands. So we are the worst possible country to have massive stamp duty in because of our planning constraints on house building. And yet we've gone ahead and done it. And by the way, this is a relatively recent thing. Now, stamp duty itself, the clue is in the name. This is a very antiquated tax. Goes back ages. But I think in 1997, it was a 1% tax on properties that cost over £125,000. Bad, but it should have been eliminated.
But we're in a far worse state. Like,
far worse.
Okay, 1% is annoying as a tax, but I don't think it stopped that many transactions.
No, it didn't. It didn't. Things have got so much worse over time. And this happened, some of it happened under Labour, most of it happened under the Conservatives, right?
Ironic, really.
And this is, I was talking to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies about this recently. He's one of the few people who really flags up the fact that the tax system became much more progressive under the Conservatives, that the rich, and the not so rich, but the decently well off, really got hammered by tax policy over those 14, 15 years. And it's not in Labour's interest to talk about that, because they say, the Tories are just for the rich and handouts to millionaires. And seemingly it's not in the Conservatives' interest to say it either, because they're all about wealth creation and everything else. But that is the bald fact of the matter, that our tax system has become much more top-heavy in so many different ways. And that, coupled with some of the ill-advised, I think, changes that the new government has made, is why we have this exodus of millionaires and entrepreneurs from Britain.
I'm sat here thinking, God, imagine if Tom was a Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Oh gosh, yeah.
No, but But imagine Rachel Reeves could talk about the economy and incentives like this.
Mm.
Imagine she did an interview with, what's her name, Emily Maitness,
Yeah.
who's been doing a lot of the political interviews recently. Laura Kuenssberg, and talked about the economy, talked about tax incentives like this. You'd be like, oh, we have a competent person in charge of our economy. We don't. We just fundamentally don't. And that's kind of depressing, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I don't, she's by no means the worst person that could have ended up in that position.
Yeah, but that's
as
not
well.
my benchmark. My benchmark is the best.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those interesting things, isn't it? When you look at the US or you look at other countries where they have political appointments to significant political positions. I mean, most people who are Treasury Secretary in the US, which actually is a much narrower, more confined role than our Chancellor of the Exchequer, will have some pretty serious economic, financial background.
Yes.
Yeah, they will understand financial markets. They will know about all this stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to make good decisions. Maybe they make better decisions at the margin, or at least they think about things in the right way and they're more conscious about the trade-offs that they're making. You know, in the old days in the UK, you had many more MPs who had lives outside Parliament.
Yes.
And who might have had private sector careers, or maybe they might have been professors as well, or they might have worked in trade unions and everything else. We have a class of professional politicians now.
Yes.
And I don't want to do the fashionable thing about saying, yuck, professional politicians,
No,
isn't
do
that
it,
horrible?
because it is, but it's factually true.
And I mean, the thing is, they're worked off their feet for the most part. They're not really well paid for the amount of work that they do and the amount of sacrifices that they make. But nevertheless, we don't have a system that gets the right position in the right people into the right positions. And that's a big problem. And because this stuff is complicated. And when you get into the nitty-gritty of government, it is extraordinarily complicated. I mean, the tax system, I forget now just how many pages long it is and how much it's grown. But it's epic, this length. I mean, it's probably longer than the Game of Thrones saga, or, Song of Fire and Ice, you put it all together. And even if that's ever finished, the tax code will still probably be longer. It's crazy. It's crazy how complicated this is. It's crazy how complicated all these different areas of regulation are. And if you're just a politician who you've probably worked very hard to get elected, but it's all been about short-term politics and knocking on doors and delivering leaflets and going to party meetings, and then you get in and you have to deal with all of the constituency business. And so it's sort of the famous thing in that film, In the Loop, isn't it, where the guy is trying
seen it.
It's sort of the spin-off of In the Thick of It.
Okay.
Armando Iannucci,
Yes.
this kind of British political satire. And I guess famously in that, the guy is trying to stop a war in the Middle East as foreign secretary, but he's having most of his time taken up by Steve Coogan, who is playing this constituent who's complaining about a wall that's fallen down in his garden. And it's satire, but like most satire, it's based on something real, which is that politicians, for the most part, are not doing the things that I suspect you and I would want them to be doing. They're probably not the right people for the roles that they're in a lot of the time. That kind of isn't their fault. They've done the things they need to do to get there. They are distracted by all kinds of other stuff, which means they're not thinking about policy much, if at all, for most of their time as parliamentarians. And of course, they might get a government job. And how long are they going to have it for? A year, 18 months? The pace of change within the cabinet and the ministerial ranks, it just goes so fast. I suspect that most ministers, by the time they've got a grip on what their department does and what they want to change, they're moved on to the next thing.
Yeah. Self-preservation plays a huge part. Post-politics career plays a big part. I'd love to know how much Nick Clegg got paid by Facebook. I'm sure it's pretty good.
Oh, he would have been paid a lot of money.
Yeah, but I think you're being quite kind. I think you're identifying the problem, but I think you're being kind. I think we lack politicians with integrity and backbone and willing to stand up and just say say what is right, what is true, what is fact, what is actually happening. I think self-preservation plays a massive part in this. I think the incentives are terrible. I mean, 90 grand a year? Like every intelligent person I know, or any smart kid I know, is probably already saying their benchmark is like, how do I get to 100 grand a year?
Right.
And then what after that? And so we're not incentivizing for the smartest people. We see these complaints when the politicians, the MPs talk about a vote for increasing their wages from 90 to 92. I'm like, pay them £500,000 a year, pay them £1 million a year, get the best people in there.
Well, you got a toxic combination where it is not a pleasant job to have anymore.
And fairly low paid with a lot of pressure. Yeah,
and in the grand scheme of things, when you consider maybe the other options that the people you want to be in Parliament and you want to be running government departments have, the pay is not great compared with the hours and the sacrifice of family life and everything that goes along with it. I would never do it. And anyone who's well, I'll tell you then. I mean, I meet so many politicians, and generally speaking, the old guys who've been there for a long time and are well established and have decent majorities, they love it, and they can spend time doing the stuff that they're really interested in. The young ones who are just really grafting to like build their name in the constituency, to keep their voters happy and everything, it's draining, and it's not what they went into politics for.
Well, I mean, if you're young and you're going into politics, you're thinking about your career, you're thinking long term, you're thinking about your mortgage. Like the one reason I would do it, I'm not going to do it because I want to do this, and I think this is important. And
I'm a politician with a massive podcast would actually be a great thing.
Sure, but I would be seen as having a bias. And look, we've certainly had more reform people here than Conservatives. We haven't had a Lib Dem person yet, but we've had Galloway on. We've had William Clouston from the SDP. We had Mike Tapp from the Labour Party. I want more If anyone from the Labour Party is listening, please come on the show. I want to talk to you. Yeah. And I might ask tough questions, but I'm not going to be a dick to you. I might be on Twitter, but come in, and we need people from the Greens. I want to talk to a broad range of people, but if I was a Reform MP or a Conservative MP, that immediately is going to have people because assume I have a certain bias and position. But the reason I'm tempted is I don't need the money. So, and I don't give a fuck if I piss people off. So I would happily go in there and shout loudly from the rooftops, Rachel Reeves, you're a moron. The most important thing you can do today is you need to pick up the phone and call Tom from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and he's going to help you fix the problems. I would be loud and noisy. I think it's the reason I'll never go. I mean, I'm not of profile enough, but say the podcast grows, I don't think I would be invited on Question Time because I'd be like, you're a liar, you're full of shit, you're a grifter. Because I don't care.
And this is what Farage does.
Yeah.
And it's what Trump has done. And I think that in many respects, that's the root of their popularity, that they seem authentic and they seem like they're speaking their mind. They know what they think and they're not afraid to say it. And I would say, what is the classic qualification to have been a successful politician over the New Labour and Conservative era? It's the ability to dodge a question and sound eloquent doing it.
Yeah. Fair.
And I mean, if I'm thinking of what do I do in politics, it's an awful lot of saying things I don't believe and trying to hold the party line and trying to avoid getting trapped into awkward answers or saying things that I might think, but I don't really want people to know. I think that is a miserable life. But now, if you have a different style of politics where it's rooted in kind of authenticity and radical thinking and speaking your mind and being very true about it and saying, actually, a lot of people are not going to agree with this, but this is what I stand for and this is what I think is the right thing. I actually think, and we're seeing that more and more, that has enormous appeal to people. In a way, and, obviously I don't really approve, but Jeremy Corbyn had some of this appeal to people as well.
I preferred Corbyn to Keir Starmer, even though he's much more socialist, and I'm completely anti-socialist, because I believe he believed what he said.
Yeah.
And I believed he would stand up for his principles, even though I disagree with them. I don't believe that Keir Starmer even knows what he is anymore. I don't believe he knows what he stands for. I think he just stands for self-preservation.
Yeah. I mean, I did, to be honest, I feared being sent to a re-education camp if Jeremy Corbyn had become Prime Minister. In a way, I'm not so worried about Keir Starmer, but there is nevertheless...
Are you sure our speech is being policed quite a bit in this country?
Well, that is true.
There is a chilling effect now.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting things is that I think economic liberty is really liberty itself. And we've drifted we don't even have the culture of freedom in this country like they do in the US. They have a culture, I've got my guns and I can say what I want. We don't have that culture yet. And I think it's something we need to do. I think we need to bring it back. But I fear this government. I actually fear them as a government. I do think whether you want to call it backdoor socialism or bureaucratic tyranny, I fear this government and where we will be in 4 years. I have significant fear.
And I think in a way, it feels like the best case scenario is continued drift, where nothing gets better and people get angrier.
No, I don't know. What, within their administration?
Well, I think in general, in their attitudes towards government and economic performance of the UK and stuff. Now, what I'm saying is effectively there's a scenario in which the government makes things much worse by pursuing the wrong policies. I have very limited confidence that they're likely to make things better. I think they didn't have the plans going in, and I think they feel too constrained by the circumstances they find themselves in. And for whatever reason, although I'd love to make that kind of intellectual breakthrough where they think, you know what, we have to go hell for leather for abundance, liberalisation, deregulation, because if we don't get growth, we're never going to be able to do anything else. It's possible they might get pushed in that direction. But what I see as the sort of standard case is just continued drift. And I think that leads to a really worsening in our politics and our society. And I mean, you talked about this kind of attitude of freedom. And I do think that we've lost it to a great extent in the UK. And what it's been replaced with is something very banal. And maybe this will sound stupid, but I think of this flight of, I don't know, it's like 8 steps leading out of Paddington Station to the canal, where you come off the Hammersmith and City and the... Have you noticed how the steps are covered with this yellow tape that has warnings on? And it's, don't look at your phone, don't run, don't carry luggage, use the lift. And it's as though the British public is not capable of getting up a flight of 8 stairs without killing themselves.
I've just got back from Norway.
Right.
Have you been to Oslo?
I haven't.
It's kind of a fantastic country when you, and a fantastic city when you arrive and leave. The train from...
That sounds kind of worrying.
Well, it is. So the train from Oslo, from the airport into Oslo is incredible.
Right.
But there's little things I see. Like, I got in the elevator and there's a fold-down seat. I was like, I've never seen a fold-down seat in an elevator. And there are warnings everywhere about this, that, or the other. But I got the train the first time I went to Oslo. The second time I didn't, I got the taxi. Now, every time I go back, I get the taxi and I get the Uber, and I always chat to the driver. And they pretty much say the same thing, but like in a worse state. So almost every car is a Tesla. Right. And I'm okay, every car is a Tesla.
So they must be very right-wing, right?
So they... but the taxi drivers always say, all I do is work. Everything works and is amazing here, but all I do is work and I have no money left at the end of it. But the last taxi driver I got told me, said, the problem is they've run out so much money, they've targeted the wealthiest, and the wealthiest left. They've all just gone to Switzerland. And Oslo, on the face of it, looks amazing, like it works. But when you talk to people working there, then they're not generally happy. Yeah. Because the tax burden is so high. But the warnings are everywhere. Yeah. Every single thing there's a warning. It's like, come on, I'm an adult here.
And and then that's it. It's infantilizing.
Yes.
And it drives me crazy. Across the piece, actually, the extent to which we're nannied and mollycoddled and treated as though we're not adults capable of making our own decisions and accepting the consequences if we make bad ones. And, you know, you can talk about freedom and you can talk about markets, but at the end of the day, if you're not willing to say, people make their choices, they bear the consequences, and it's up to them to determine what's risky and what's not. Maybe I want to look at my phone on that last step, or maybe I'm in a rush and I need to go quickly, or I'm capable of carrying a suitcase down 8 steps. All of these things are possible, and those are my choices to make.
And if I make a mistake, I'm the idiot.
Yeah, and it could be invest in cryptocurrency. Why not? Caveat emptor. It could be I want to smoke, I want to drink, I may want to consume other substances. Not me personally, but many people do. Those are ultimately decisions. There's another radical idea for you that should be for individuals to make.
Well, I'd be largely with you on a much more liberal policy towards drugs. I'm not sure I would deregulate fentanyl, but I am a previous, my son knows this, somebody who used to take a lot of drugs. Back in my advertising days, you know.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. There was Friday night, let's have a drink and pop to the toilet every 15 minutes. But there is a significant problem with people who want to take cocaine in that the private market we have right now incentivizes the wrong people to distribute it because they will happily put any kinds of shit in it. It's dangerous. And what was really interesting, there's a guy called Ross Ulbricht. He's just been released from prison. He built a website called The Silk Road. That's how I discovered Bitcoin. It was essentially Amazon for anything, but drugs was a large part of it. there is a huge problem in the US now with people taking cocaine and they're taking fentanyl and they're dying. It is a significant problem. By the way, I haven't taken drugs in nearly 13 years, so it's my old life. But when he created the Silk Road, he added a review system. So if you were selling drugs on the website, people would review based on the quality.
Yeah.
And so what would happen is the best quality produce would go to the top and the worst would go to the bottom. And so it incentivized the drug dealers to provide a clean product. The Drug Policy Alliance themselves said it reduced harm, deaths in the system. So it was a radical idea that objectively worked. But obviously, it was criminalized. He got a kingpin charge, double life sentence plus 40 years. He only was just released because Donald Trump gave him a pardon. But to me, that is just a reflection of most parts of our societies that we try and regulate, that we create these downstream issues. I'm with you on certain liberalization of drug laws.
Certain. Look, I think it's sensible
I don't think we should
to
have
be
cocaine in Tesco.
realistic about this. Yeah, sure. But I think there's an interesting historical story here again, actually, which is that for the most part, prohibition makes things more dangerous.
Of course, yeah.
So, and you can see this in the evolution of drugs, but I mean, even alcohol. Why did America shift from being a beer drinking country to really being very into liquor? It was prohibition, because if you have to smuggle alcohol, you want the highest possible concentration and the lowest volume. And it probably wasn't, for the most part, the kind of spirits we would enjoy drinking today. A lot of moonshine, a lot of really nasty stuff. And this is where cocktails came from, right? It was such bad liquor that it had to be cut with juices and sodas and everything else.
Amazing.
Right. And you see it in drugs. Cocaine starts off with, I guess, people drinking coca leaf tea or something. And then it evolves through increasingly concentrated and increasingly dangerous forms. Heroin, the same. I'm not going to recommend that anybody smokes an opium pipe. Probably a lot less bad, individually and societally, than fentanyl being widely available. But you make things illegal. You create, first of all, huge profits for people who are willing to take the risk to distribute this stuff. There's a lot of violence and criminality associated with it as well. And what is the outcome for the people who are going to use narcotics come what may? They get a much more dangerous product at the end of it. A product, they don't know what they're taking a lot of the time. But yes, ever higher concentrations and lower volumes, any substance you prohibit, this is what is almost inevitably going to happen. So I totally agree. It's not like I want to legalize fentanyl and have it available in corner shops or crystal meth or whatever drug du jour is. But I would say if we hadn't had prohibition, no one would have come up with these products. Or at least no one would want or need these products because there would be relatively safer and more acceptable alternatives available. And it's like there are so many harms associated with drinking alcohol. Sure. But is Anheuser-Busch waging paramilitary wars in Latin America to protect its business? No. So, it's one of those things where the intention is good for people to lead healthier lives.
The outcome is too.
The outcomes are, for many people, catastrophic.
God, this has been brilliant. We haven't really talked about Bitcoin, and I wanted to just bring it up because there has been this crypto bill out. I am obviously a big supporter and proponent of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I like anything which takes power away from the government. I'm kind of repeating what Liz Truss said to me when I asked her about it, but I do. It's been a good decision for me. I think a lot of people don't understand Bitcoin. I have concerns about the direction of Bitcoin at the moment. We have these, I don't know, it's become corporatized, but whatever. But the idea of this fixed money that has a fixed limit, whereby I get to, when the government chose to get rid of the gold standard, I can choose to live on a Bitcoin standard myself. It's been a good decision for me, and I support it broadly. Does it come up at all within your institute?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And actually, in a serious way, we've got long heritage with, not with Bitcoin, but with sort of the foundational ideas behind Bitcoin. Well, gold, for example. But I mean, our founding inspiration was F.A. Hayek.
Yes.
He won the Nobel Prize in 1974 for his work in economics and on business cycles and so on. He wrote a paper for us in 1978, which was called The Denationalisation of Money.
Was this where we'd have to do it with a sleight of hand, take the control and distribution of money from the government?
I wouldn't frame it that way necessarily. Okay. I mean, I think what he was saying was, many of us look back to the gold standard and think that the era of the gold standard and free banking and limited government involvement in money and finance was great. And the period of the classical gold standard, which didn't last that long historically, maybe it was about 80 years or something overall, but that was one of the most stable and prosperous and progressing periods that we've had in human history, relatively speaking. It's quite difficult to wave a magic wand and bring back that kind of thing, because as soon as you had a gold standard again, any government that wanted to misbehave would suspend the gold standard or revalue, and the whole thing broke down. There was probably a kind of mystique around the gold standard that made it work, and once that was broken, it's very hard to put it back together. Mm-hmm. So Hayek was saying, but can you trust the government in the absence of a hard constraint like gold not to inflate the currency away? And of course, he's writing in 1978, so this was a very live issue in a way that it might be a live issue here over the last few years. And he was all about competition and competing private alternatives and the best outcomes emerging spontaneously from that kind of interaction. So he proposed this idea that rather than having state-issued fiat currencies, so currencies that are unbacked by anything, you could have competing private currencies. And these currencies would compete over how good they were as a store of value, say, or how easy they were to make transactions with, and all of these other factors. And he didn't sort of prophesy Bitcoin per se, but I think it was an intellectual framework that maybe got people thinking about alternatives to state-issued currency. And I can remember when I first, before Bitcoin was a thing, in my early think tank career, we were having some radical conversations about money, and we were thinking about the denationalization of money. And we were thinking, well, in a way, like supermarket points and air miles are a kind of private currency. Yeah. You could see there were these bizarre conspiracy theories, weren't there, at one point in the mid-2000s that Tesco was going to grow so big it was going to effectively take over the world. And I had this sort of thought experiment. Well, imagine if Tesco did take on some of the properties of a modern state. It would obviously be competing with other similar organisations. Sorry, I'm going to be really wacky for you for a minute. But maybe Tesco is providing healthcare, and maybe Tesco is providing its own private currency. Mm-hmm. I was like, actually, that would be pretty cool.
Because Sainsbury's would do the same.
Because Sainsbury's would do the same, and then there'd be a luxury option from Marks and Spencer or whatever it would be. There's another interesting historical thing, actually, that in the Industrial Revolution, there was a massive demand for coins for industrialists to pay their workers. There was an insufficient supply of coins coming from the Bank of England, and this could cause problems when wages were due to be paid. Now, you had a couple of things. One was you had the massive increase in kind of the provision of credit. So I don't know, if you were Cadbury and you had your workers and you couldn't pay them in coin or cash, you would give them credit to buy things from you or to buy things from other local merchants. So those kind of things happen, sort of shadow currencies. But also, my former colleague George Selgin from the Cato Institute has written a book about this called Good Money. You got industrialists minting their own coins and creating their own private currencies, which, because they were backed by, whether it was Cadbury or Roundtree. Actually, I don't know if they were specifically the industrialists that minted their own coins, but you kind of get the idea. Because these were big people, big businesses, so it could be Amazon or Google or something today. You say, look at this, I can trust this. This is going to have value. This allows me to engage in the exchange that I need to do to live my life. It doesn't matter that government isn't providing it. Here is a private currency. And you could get situations where these things would circulate simultaneously, but people would know this company is a lot more dependable and has a lot stronger balance sheet than this one. So this might trade at par value, and we might discount this coin over here. This is a less valuable, less secure competing private currency. And so over time, you'd expect people to trade from one into the other. So this was sort of the idea of denationalizing money, that in the same way that competitive enterprises provide a range of other goods and services, and through the competitive process, it tends to get better and better. The same principle could apply to money. And Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies more broadly are one manifestation of that. And I remember when I first heard about Bitcoin, I mean, I wish I'd invested in Bitcoin the first time I heard about it, but many people can say the same thing. I thought, wow, this is amazing, because this is potentially an implementation of what seemed like a very radical thought experiment, but maybe could come into practice.
Well, it certainly has, and it's had its competing digital currencies, but every single one has failed against Bitcoin because of a range of factors. Mostly that they're centralized, that they focused on different properties. They've tried to, for example, they try and beat Bitcoin in terms of speed of transaction, but that means they've become more centralized. Like Bitcoin has tried to stay radically decentralized. It has the benefit of being the first. But I look at how broken money is, and I've chosen because of that to keep spare money in Bitcoin, whether it's personal or business, and that's been good for me. But I am also kind of have this bias whereby, well, it's been good for me because it's gone up. Has it gone up because it's better money, or has it gone up because we're in a phase where we're repricing in terms of Bitcoin? And so I find it a really interesting time. But I've always hated and despised the fact that the government have weaponized the banks against Bitcoin. Like it became difficult to move money into Bitcoin. So I was quite, obviously, when I saw Reform come out with their bill, I was like, this is good. This is interesting. Reducing capital gains tax. I actually think they should eliminate capital gains tax on Bitcoin. Might not happen. So at least Bitcoin.
Let's eliminate it altogether. How about that?
Well, yes. I mean, yeah. I think this sovereign Bitcoin reserve fund is kind of interesting. That raise up the wealth of the nation. I think they should also remove capital gains tax on small transactions, sub £100 transactions. You shouldn't be having to track these and pay capital gains. They should be treating it like money. I'd like to see them do some stuff with the energy industry. We curtail £1 billion of £1.5 billion. We looked last time of wind energy. There are Bitcoin mining companies who say, well, we would buy that from you.
Right.
We might buy it cheap, but we'll buy it from you, and they can integrate with the grid and stabilize the grid. I think it can go further, but I think it was a great first step. I mean, to me, this is radical thinking.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I have to admit, looked through the detail of all of this, but I think a lot of what you're saying, sounds encouraging.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's encouraging strictly when it comes to cryptocurrencies, because I think the natural incentive of government will be, this is new, we don't like it, let's try and clamp down on it.
Yeah,
it's a threat. It's a threat to us and our monopoly over the currency and everything else. Now, the one thing I do wonder with Bitcoin and other cryptos is, are they really currencies yet? Or are they future currencies?
They're future currencies.
I think that's where a lot of the value comes from.
Well, it's tough as a unit of account.
Yeah.
So we sell football shirts for our football team on our website. You can pay in Bitcoin. We don't price it in Bitcoin because
I was going to say it'd be an expensive shirt these days.
Well, so we price it in pounds and we allow you to pay in Bitcoin. Yeah. It is not a unit of account yet. I don't know if it ever will be. I mean, I find it very difficult to accept that major Western nations will give up their currencies. And look, I know some do. I know Milei wants Argentina to dollarize, and I get that. He wants the next stable currency. But I just think it's a check and balance on the government. If you have a free, open market where you're not regulated, where you're not prevented from buying Bitcoin, when the government prints too much money and there's inflation, maybe they will put it into Bitcoin because you can't print more of it.
Yeah.
I don't know where long-term this plays out, but I just like the idea that I can choose to exit from the fiat system.
Yeah.
Because, I was talking again to Connor about this on the way. It's like when I was, I seem to remember when I was early teens, my dad used to keep money in a bank account and they would have interest of 5%, 6%, 7%, decent interest rates. I mean, I don't even know if I get 0.5% anymore now. Certainly the interest rate is always below inflation. So there's no incentive to keep money in the bank. Do I buy property? No, I just buy Bitcoin. That's what I just do. But I like the fact that I have that exit. So if it's just a check and balance on the government, great. I'm interested to see. My only question on Bitcoin now is that some people have figured out the cheat code and we're getting people hoarding vast quantities of Bitcoin.
Right.
What does that mean? How does that play out? Are they the new kingmakers? Are they the new banks? I don't know. I'm interested to see how that plays out. But
I mean, I just find this stuff fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's one of those really big breakthroughs, I suppose, that no one would have conceived of this 20 years ago. I mean, maybe Hayek had it in some embryonic sense.
I'm sure he said, it was Hayek, or maybe it was Friedman. One of them said, we need to take control of the money away from government, but we have to do it in a subtle sleight of hand. Right. And it feels like this has been that subtle sleight of hand.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of sounds like Milton Friedman in a way. It may have been him, because I mean, he effectively wanted to put a computer in charge.
Yeah.
And just have, a certain amount of money created every year, flatline.
We might get that with AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but we'll just have to revisit this and do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've really enjoyed
Happy to
it.
come back.
If people want to learn more about the Institute of Economic Affairs, where do they go? And what do you, and like any closing thoughts for people?
Yeah, okay, well, so the first, that's easy. Where do they go? So iea.org.uk or our Substack, insider.iea.org.uk. Best way to follow all of our stuff. And we've got a great YouTube channel. Well, I think it's pretty good anyway, with a lot of our own podcasts and this kind of content going out on a weekly basis. So youtube.com/IEA London. Closing thoughts. Look, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's nice to talk about things in such long format.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like to do, what we call waging the war of ideas. Like, I don't really feel like we've been having a battle.
No.
Exactly. We agree on a lot of stuff. But for me, it's great that now, and this is one of the great things with the new media environment, that there is space to talk about and think about things in a big, radical way. And I think we're at a moment in our politics and our national culture where we need to think big and we need to think radical. And the worst thing for radicalism is what they call like a 3-minute disco on BBC Radio. So it's you and another person, you have 3 minutes just to try and get one narrow point about something that's in the, there is no scope for thinking. And I think that media environment, 24/7 news media, has driven the kind of narrowing of terms of debate and the professionalization in kind of a negative way of politics that we've talked about, and has led to this idea of just the uniparty, or this long, steady decline of basically people just trying to do the same things in different ways for a long period and it not working, but still nothing getting shaken up. So I think when you have space to talk and to think, and actually a chance to be radical without immediately being shouted down, to think the unthinkable, that was always the phrase in kind of the glory years of the IEA and some of the other free market think tanks, that we think the unthinkable, and that's our purpose.
Correct.
And we try and change the climate of opinion. And we hope that politics and reality will follow.
Well, we hope Ofcom stays away from us because we're largely unregulated at the moment. Yeah, fuck off, Ofcom. Anyway, listen, I've loved it. Consider it an open invite. If you want to come back,
thank you very
or
much.
Any of your colleagues want to come back, please do. I love this. Really enjoyed it. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll see you soon.